I am a big fan of One Punch Man, but oddly enough, despite its massive surge in popularity, I haven't seen the other super hit from the prolific author of One Punch Man. Entitled Mob Psycho 100, this is a show with a main character that has the same face as One Punch Man Saitama, is animated with a degree of polish the likes of which don't even reside within my dreams, and is about psychics and ghosts, I think? I'm honestly not too sure about that last one, and that concludes my summary of the knowledge I have in my brain concerning this series. I'm serious. I know nothing else about this story, so this one should be interesting to explore with fresh eyes, and given that the series is officially finished, there's no better time than right now to review the anime, the manga, the music, and the behind-the-scenes production of this massively successful series. Will I enjoy this series more than I enjoyed One Punch Man? Will it live up to the whirlwind of hype surrounding it? When this video is done, what will I think of Mob Psycho 100? If everyone is not special, maybe you can be what you want to be. You and me are not alike, night and day. What the? Alrighty, so this isn't a long series by any means. The manga is only 16 volumes long, and it is the single most interesting manga I've ever wanted to take a look at. As I'm sure many of you are aware, one, unlike many other popular mangakas of the modern manga scene, doesn't exactly have a conventional artistic style one might expect from someone that's accrued such enormous success across the world. I think that's honestly fascinating and speaks to the characters he's created and endearing drawings he's grown a substantial following with. And so, to be clear, I'm not discounting the original manga. In fact, while I will be placing a hefty amount of emphasis and attention to the gloriously produced anime, I have always been curious to see the source material from which the studios draw inspiration and guidance from. Unlike One Punch Man, which received the red carpet treatment by being redrawn by Yusuke Murata, possibly the best artist in the business right now, Mob's manga is one's original artwork for all of us to enjoy, raw, unfiltered, and entirely true to his vision of the story. And so, because of that, I'll be curious to explore how or if his original version has been adapted, compromised, or enhanced by the vehicle of this incredibly impressive looking anime. In this video, I plan on analyzing the source manga from one. I want to dissect the music of this series as well as break down its incredibly healthy production and development behind the scenes. And that's not even to mention this crazy story. And episode 1 seems like a great place to start. Okay, so I've sat down and I've watched all of Mob Psycho 100's first season, and this show is amazing. This, unironically, might be my new favorite anime ever. Yeah, I'm gonna spend the next, I don't know, half an hour, 40 minutes, how much is on the clock, talking to you about how it's made, why it's so damn good, and why I've never seen a show like this. Okay, here I go. The introduction. Unlike Attack on Titan, One Piece, or Naruto, unlike JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, or even Hunter x Hunter, Mob Psycho 100 opens its narrative with no clear story or path forward. Instead, the first 3 episodes or so deal with singular events, self-contained stories of sorts that act as a mechanism to primarily introduce us to the key characters of this story. In other words, it doesn't give us an obvious narrative reason to keep watching, like Dragon Ball did with I gotta collect all the Dragon Balls, or like Attack on Titan did with we gotta get across the walls and freedom and all that kind of crack, right? And yeah, Mob Psycho 100 doesn't really do any of that, at least not in any obvious way. And to be honest, normally when it comes to stories that start off without establishing a clear-cut goal, they tend to lose me quickly. However, there was something about this series that felt different. Normally, I'm waiting for a narrative through line to hold onto when I start watching or reading something. But when it comes to one's best work, the author of both One Punch Man and Mob Psycho, he actively tries to fight against that, and I think it helps to reinforce what his work stands for. Mob Psycho 100, much like One Punch Man, despite having wildly different main characters, represents a fantastical world with plenty of over-the-top, even silly gag humor. The goal here is to make us laugh, and it more than definitely succeeds in that effort. However, as is the case with one's work and his most popular characters in Saitama and Mob himself, while we might see these stories they occupy as being silly or over the top, these appearances are designed by one to be deceiving. In other words, there's always more to these characters and these stories than what initially meets the eye. How a character is revealed to us oftentimes tells us a lot about their personality. In the case of Saitama in One Punch Man, he's very quickly depicted as the world's de facto superhero before, moments later, blowing away the monster in an instant. It is only later we find out that he's largely an unknown, doing it because he wants to. Such is the subversive nature of One Punch Man. Mob Psycho, while similarly subversive, takes an entirely different but similarly appropriate approach. Unlike Saitama, who was depicted as this impressive, impactful, and domineering superhero that's there to save the day, Mob Psycho opens by introducing Reigen, a smooth-talking, largely good-natured con artist pretending to be psychic for hire. He is Mob's boss, and while he is a supporting character, Mob isn't even the second or third character introduced in his own story. And how the anime decides to introduce him is, honestly, I think, ingenious. As I will soon explore, a driving theme within Mob Psycho 100's narrative is that of manipulation and deceit, how others can use people to get ahead in this world, and the philosophy that comes with those that choose to not leverage their position to put down others. In the first episode, Reigen accepts a job to exorcise a ghost, fails to do so because of course he does, and then resorts to calling on Mob, someone who actually is talented and has the skills necessary to deal with this exorcism. He is the fifth character introduced in his own story. And when he is introduced, it's because Reigen needs him. Unlike Reigen, who exploded onto our screens with plenty of charisma and energy, or the dramatic and silly scene the couple he's dealing with had, or even the grand entrance the ghost made. Instead of all of that, Mob is introduced from afar, as a car that already looks like it's part of the background pulls out of the way, revealing some unassuming, shy wallflower, the likes of which look more unremarkable than any other character in this series. This is a perfect introduction to Mob as a character, and everything from his design, introduction, and even voice actor was measured to reflect that specific sense of normality surrounding him. Where Saitama eventually flashes onto her screen after a dramatic build-up, Mob, on the other hand, looks aggressively unimpressive. That is until... And as we divert our attention away from the action-packed set pieces of the first couple of episodes, this choice pays dividends and we begin to understand more why this direction for the character was chosen. We see him in school and in his day-to-day life. We see his relationship with his parents and brother, how he's failing both academically and physically, and how he has no friends inside or outside of school to speak of. Reflected in the first episode's closing but sweet and somber scene that reinforces the relationship he has with Reigen as Mob looks on at others chatting and exchanging life experiences before happily returning back to Reigen's side, the closest person Mob has to a real friend inviting him to share dinner. Outside of that, the series, due to its muted and somewhat passive main character, creates a rather large vacuum of charisma to be filled, and so I present to you the king of Riz, Reigen. The brief description I offered of Reigen paints him like an awful person, and while he sort of is in his own way, due to the way the character is written, it depicts a more roguish character than a complete reprehensible one. So much so that he pretty much steals the show if you don't pay close enough attention. In these opening episodes, and indeed through to the end, the fashion with which he's able to disarm what would otherwise be a dangerous or jailable offense with his gift of conversation is a fascinating superpower I've not seen presented in a more entertaining way on the page or silver screen in years. Reigen is a once-in-a-generation type of character, and he must be protected at all costs. At this point, there's a lot of conscious, artistic choices being made, like the voice actor and the animation, so I want to touch on that for just a second because they really help to elevate this particular direction the story decided to go in. Bringing this show to life from such a unique source material is a challenging task no matter the experience or age of the director involved in bringing it to life. And when I found out that the series was adapted by director Yuzuru Tachikawa in his late 30s, I was blown away. However, he did have an impressive resume to his name. Outside of working for prolific studios like Madhouse and Studio Pierrot, he's directed the beloved Death Billiards and Death Parade anime, featured on Kill la Kill and Attack on Titan, and also co-directed Terror in Resonance with the legendary Shinichiro Watanabe, of none other than Cowboy Bebop fame. And through doing so, built up a huge reputation for himself, and by extension, an extensive list of talented friends from which he was able to draw from to work on Mob Psycho 100. I mentioned earlier that Mob appearing a certain way in this anime was a necessary part of the story, and so I think this quote from Author One on the subject of adapting his manga was rather illuminating. He said, The only thing I asked the staff to do was to keep the anime's mob looking as close to the original as possible. But other than that, I'd rather an adaptation have some character to it than be a slave to the source. And through interviews, we can see as clear as day that Tachikawa, the series director, took the original work extremely seriously. And this rather serious and dedicated approach to the source material is clear from the get-go. Mob Psycho 100's animation style, approach, and philosophy largely runs counter to the standard practice of the modern animation industry in Japan. It shuns CGs, instead falling back on hand-drawn vehicles and interiors, all in the name of giving this series an old-school flavor, and to that effect, the legendary Yoshimichi Kameda came in as character designer, renowned for his inky and snappy animation across an endless number of shows like Full Metal Alchemist, Space Dandy, and of course, One Punch Man. And in this first episode, it's clear as day that he leads this outing. His work is the core foundation of Mob's visuals. Sketchy lines, dynamic and exaggerated facial expressions, snappy gesticulations. It's all Kameda to its core. He is quite a strict supervisor, but with talent like this, it works and keeps things alive consistently. Which is wonderful because the first episode bounces around from scene to scene, encounter after encounter, and without a consistently fun and expressive design and animation philosophy such as this, conversations such as those which Reigen engages in might not hit the highs the anime otherwise succeeded in reaching. This choice of initially and predominantly depicting Mob as an aggressively mediocre and mundane schoolboy was a measured but conscious effort. And as it happens, Setsuo, the actor who voices Mob in the anime, is a complete newbie. And when asked about this choice, Tachikawa had this to say: "I wanted Mob to have a voice nobody would recognize. I wanted the voice actor, just like Mob himself, to be someone relatively unremarkable. We had a huge number of candidates for the role, but in the end, Ito's voice most fit my idea of Mob." And so, I hope this brief analysis of the series' opening helps to shed some light on why I don't mind that the series didn't open with a clear narrative goal in mind, because it does seem to have a vague narrative goal. Mob has expressed to some degree a desire. That is, outside of the one vertical he's particularly exceptional at, he's weak in others and he wants more. He wants connection. He wants what the everyday person has. And him being this exceptional person doesn't seem to matter if you have nothing else. And I'm interested and invested now in seeing if he has the will to make this a reality for himself. And most importantly, how these obstacles and emotional stressors contribute to one of the most interesting mechanics used in this narrative: the inclusion of a percentage meter counting up to 100, which represents an explosion of sorts. This naturally creates anticipation. And over the first 3 episodes, as we build towards that eventual explosion, we're anticipating. We gain a familiarity with the aspects of his life that actually trigger this metaphorical meter to rise closer and closer to a boiling point. In episode 2, Mob's introduced to a concept of seizing the day, because someday there might not be any time left to seize. And through that episode, he's being pulled in 2 separate directions by 2 different parties that both want or need something from him explicitly. The Telepathy Club threatened with abolishment from the class president due to lack of interest, and then there's of course Reigen, who without Mob would lose the only tangible asset that grants his business legitimacy. At the end of the day, this is the story of a young man being pushed and pulled emotionally in 2 opposing directions, neither of which have his best interest at heart, and makes the conclusion of this tale all the more satisfying when he chooses, quite bravely, to step outside of his comfort zone, choosing neither easy option offered to him, and instead chooses the path of self-improvement with, low-key, my favorite group in this entire show, the Good Gym Bros. They are amazing. The 3rd episode, however, is where we get a taste of what exactly we've been building to. And Mob in action is outstanding. And this crazy musical instrumentation that plays when he uses his powers is Wait, I haven't even talked about the music. Okay, music. I don't think I need to say anything about this OP. It's easily one of the most gorgeously stylized OPs I've ever come across. Brought to reality by Kameda, he apparently took inspiration for this opening's animation from the music video by Miyavi entitled Afraid to Be Cool. A momentary glance is all you need to see the Neon City element from the OP was heavily inspired by it. But in terms of music, the theme song not only fits the series perfectly, counting to 100 with a building, swirling rhythm before devolving into a crescendo of instrumentation at the end, but it is also the only song I've ever heard for the very first time that I immediately loved and, in tandem, was able to sing along to, because I of course count to 100. humble brag. In terms of the broader series though, one of the most fantastic musical additions to the story comes by way of how they utilize certain musical themes. A musical theme in this context is the primary piece of melodic information within a piece of music, which can, but doesn't have to, represent a narrative concept. Take the Imperial March by John Williams in Star Wars that represents the evil of the Republic, or Hedwig's theme from Harry Potter that represents places of safety and courage. However, this psychic theme of mobs is out of this world, and I have to talk about it. If there's one single thing that the OST for this show achieves, the one element that I would argue is the most important, it's its carving out of a unique sound identity for itself from day one. People often don't give music the narrative credit it deserves, and there really is a story that can be told through music that I want to get into right now, because this soundtrack is incredible. Between the unique instrument used for Mob's theme, the off-kilter traditional drums and strings that are peppered throughout Mob and Reigen's lives, and the common but fascinating use of microtonal and out-of-tune instruments everywhere, gives me a ton to explore when it comes to analyzing music. But Mob Psycho 100's composer Kenji Kawai establishes an unmistakably immersive and unique soundscape for the series that both cements its distance from the contemporaries as well as wonderfully serves the characters and atmosphere of the show. And yes, you heard me right. He uses off-key microtonal music, and boy is it everywhere in this score. So why does he choose to use out-of-key instrumentation at times? Well, as a quick and nerdy background for those uninitiated, in traditional Western musical theory, there are 12 notes in a scale. This is what 98% of the notes you hear in any given month are made out of. Microtonal notes, on the other hand, are notes in between the 12 notes in our Western scale. So, in this track, found in episode 3, many of the notes are microtonal, that is to say, slightly flat or sharp of notes that we would be used to hearing. And this use of off-key and microtonal notes in the show's score really does an extreme amount of lifting in giving the music not only a unique, unmistakable flavor compared to other anime, but also, I think, serves to communicate the awkward, stilted vibe of Mob as a character in this story narratively. This theme is practically the musical representation of Mob's character in the musical score. It's off-tuned in the same way that Mob is sort of out of place in his real world. He doesn't fit in anywhere, just like these notes. And that's such a wonderfully inspired musical idea. In episode 3, the story largely deals with Mob being misled into a cultist gathering which facilitates our introduction to the troublesome and power-hungry spirit known henceforth as Dimple. The explosion, however, that takes place towards the conclusion of episode 3 is an almost terrifying and otherworldly scene to witness take shape before us. There are a set of themes in this soundtrack that are related to the stress that Mob often feels preceding his explosions, and the one used in this episode is downright terrifying. Entitled Toraum, if you didn't know anything about this show, you'd assume that this sense of terror is meant to be pointed towards the scary ghost brainwashing the masses in Dimple. But as onlookers, we of course understand that it is in fact likely pointed towards what sort of terrifying thing may happen once Mob reaches 100% and snaps. These opening episodes offer us our first glimpse into how scary Mob Psycho 100 could be. From the emotional state of Mob clear for us all to see, to the music used, to the animation, to the storyboard. And that's not even to mention some of the more obscure artistic expressions otherwise seen in this anime that give the series its otherworldly feel. Paint on glass animation is used all over this series and comes straight from Miyu Sato and adds such an unusual, almost ethereal, possessive, sinister atmosphere to the animation for certain more intense scenes and the series ending animation, and it is utterly perfect for a series like Mob Psycho 100. Episode 3's animation is led by Gozei Oda, an ex-Studio Ghibli in-between artist who gained substantial connections at Studio Bones after leaving. He's very much well known for his animation that isn't hugely concerned with detail, but instead with stretchy motion and unique smears as seen all over Mob's third episode. It's not something hugely uncommon by today's standards, but it's a style he helped cultivate and popularize. And speaking of convention, typically when an episode of an animated series is produced, the animators actively try to stick as close to the model sheets produced by the character designers to retain a consistent look across the series. However, episode 3 is intentionally off-model. Sticking true to one's desire to allow the animation staff freedom, this episode where Mob contends with the cultist demonstrates that unbridled creativity. Sometimes doing this can alienate viewers, but clearly the staff saw the beauty in its uniqueness as Kameda stepped away from doing any art corrections for this one and let the episode sing untouched. Other episodes can offer their unique flares of brilliance, but nothing quite stands out quite like the creative choices made for episode 3. This is all to say that these 3 episodes all serve to create a wonderfully emotional and intense introduction to this series. I've never in my life seen a story brought to the silver screen with such a profoundly strong, intense sense of direction and identity. One Punch Man's first season truly does stand out as a monument to how incredibly flashy the talent residing within Japan can be, but Mob Psycho 100's introduction here demonstrates what a unified approach can offer a production with such enormous talent behind it, the likes of which would only be surpassed as time goes on in episodes 4 and beyond. Episode 3's cultish setting amongst those that were brainwashed by Dimple to smile time and again offered the perfect stage for Mob to naturally demonstrate what he can do, and more importantly, offered us a taste of what he's capable of. And little did we know that right around the next corner, something even more devastating was awaiting us. Teru versus Mob. Thematically, I think episode 4 and 5 contends with some of the core themes of this story and in many ways delivers some of the best action we've seen in this series depending on your tastes. And let me tell you, when I was sitting down to digest this series on day 1, after having already been blown away by what the first 3 introductory episodes have offered, episode 5 shattered any and all high expectations I had already had for this series. When watching this, episode 5 quickly became my absolute favorite episode. However, to think of this as a single episode success would be ignorant, as it not only stands on the shoulders of all the exposition elegantly delivered to us from the first 3 episodes, but also stands as one half of a 2-episode arc, with the 4th episode offering up some of the more introspective elements to what ultimately becomes one of the best animated episodes of television I've ever seen in my life. The human trait or narrative mechanism, take your pick, that more often than not drives the plot forward in this story is this constant need from others to push in the direction of seeking more power, more control, despite all the status, power, or abilities they may or may not have, and to achieve this, they again seek to manipulate directly or indirectly the odds into their favor. The class bully, otherwise called Onigawara, is such an individual, as we learn of the criminal or thuggish world he's vying for greater respect within. Similarly, there's a new character introduced called Teruki Hanazawa, or Teru, and he's very much someone to look out for in Mob's case, as he seems to not only have everything that Mob seems to want, but also happens to be gifted with psychic abilities just like Mob. But something I'd like to chat about before we get into the real substance of this mini-arc is the small story that facilitates the first moment my excitement launched me from my chair and into a fit of laughing and anticipation. As we know, Mob struggles with athletics and physical fitness in addition to pretty much every other aspect of his life that isn't linked to his psychic abilities. In episode 2, he volunteered to join the Body Improvement Club, and despite it being filled with a group of conventionally looking bodybuilder types, they are, without question, the sweetest and most supportive force in Mob's life presently. They do not use him, they just support him as if he was part of the family despite his clear struggles. In other words, they admire his determination to plant each step in front of the other simply because he's trying to better himself and nothing more. That's so awesome and honestly stands out in this series of manipulators. However, in this very episode, through the manipulation of many key characters, Mob is led to an ambush that leads the gym bros showing up to save the day, and the way they are depicted in this moment they arrive, it's like the 5 horsemen of the ass-whooping apocalypse arrives to serve them their collective asses. They're there to save Mob. It's so funny and overly dramatic with appropriate animation and music to emphasize this. It's easily the funniest and most oddly wholesome moment in the series for me. そもそも超能力なんて生きていく上で必要ないんだ. This is the conversation that reveals Mob's internal philosophy regarding his powers and his willingness to use them. It's a beautiful and resonant sentiment that colors not just this mini-arc, but indeed the rest of the series and beyond. When it was revealed that Ritsu, his younger brother, wasn't altruistically considerate of Mob and secretly harbored a significant amount of resentment towards him, it by default introduced a phenomenal extra layer of nuance and complexity to this seemingly simple and lighthearted story. In this brief but illuminating conversation, Ritsu asks if there are things he, Mob, can't have if he chooses to use his psychic abilities. And Mob responds, yes. Muscles. The ability to understand girls. To read his surroundings and get more wisdom. It's been explained and demonstrated that Ritsu has everything that Mob himself wants. He's popular and academically successful. And echoing this reality, Mob continues to say in return that he himself is envious of his brother for being able to do all of that. And in my view, this small statement highlights the key difference in thinking between Mob and the person who challenges him to an epic showdown later in this arc. Teru versus Mob is what many might consider to be the action highlight of this season, though I would personally argue it's but one of many. It's an amazing season. That said, it is a stupendous spectacle to bear witness to if ever there was one, and is driven entirely by character motivations, making it all the more emotionally compelling. A well-defined character is one that's capable of making decisions that are consistent with what we understand are their goals and beliefs of that established character. This is why we find characters like Captain America compelling, why Tony Stark is a thrill to watch, and even why Vegeta all the way through Dragon Ball Z was captivating to follow, because we knew what his thought process would be, and when he makes decisions, it's captivating. When characters make decisions that run counter to their beliefs, that's when our immersion is shattered and we start to scrutinize the script. And thankfully, the opposite is true for the great character writing moments, which is why, in my opinion, divorced from all the action, thrilling music and animation, this fight is fundamentally, on a written word, brilliant. Not just because I enjoyed the characters, but because Mob and Teru in this instance represent opposing answers to a certain philosophical question that this show is asking. And that question is, should you use your powers for your benefit, whether they be supernatural or not? And Mob says no. Teru says yes. And this fight, more than just a clashing of powers and fists, is a battle of ideals. And whoever wins will likely change the other fundamentally forever. Interestingly, the very existence of Teru as a character highlights that Mob, if he so chose to compromise his ideals, could have everything he so clearly wants and yearns for. Teru uses his powers to manipulate people, to scare larger and more intimidating people to do his bidding, and can even leverage his abilities to heighten his physical prowess. All areas we thought Mob just lacked in are now areas we can see he chooses not to utilize because, as pointed out in the last episode, those that choose to use their positions or powers for selfish desires in an unfair manner are often blind to the shortcomings those shortcuts often open them up to. And as we see with Teru, oftentimes can lure them into believing that they are a god above all scrutiny and competition. And hilariously, but also fittingly, Reigen is the one who helped to instill that particular outlook on life for Mob. And when I learned that, I didn't know quite what to think. And in truth, it made me like and enjoy Reigen even more than I was already doing, if that was even possible. It's absolutely possible, and it happens at the end, and I'm definitely going to talk about it. But back on topic. This fight is amazing. Mob might be an oblivious character, but the author, one, sure does know how to write dimwits with strong moral characters. This is such a wonderful scene, and the dismantling of Teru's life philosophy is scathing. We are the same, he says. Without the powers, you're an average loser just like me. With the only difference being, Mob has the courage to navigate his world and life without them. The physical transformation that Teru undergoes as he slowly loses his mind fighting Mob is brilliant to see also, and not to mention hilarious. And perfectly, when Teru resorts to attacking Mob with his bare hands, he actually makes contact and chokes him to the point where he, Mob, begins to let his consciousness slip away. And as a result, we're building to an explosion when... What a wimpy punch. But this very gesture, despite it being so weak, is the heaviest philosophical blow thrown in this battle of ideals. For despite the dire circumstances, he refuses to use his powers. This is what moral conviction looks like. Not doing things because they are easy, but doing them because they are the right thing to do in that moment, despite being difficult. If he hadn't already, this is the moment where I believe Mob gained the respect of literally everyone else watching along at home. From this point on, we're offered glimpses into the past where he and his brother, as little kids, were ambushed by thugs. Mob blacks out, and when he awakens, their bodies are strewn across the street with blood everywhere. This is a formative time in his life, one that I'm sure impacted Mob's fear concerning his powers and their outright use in day-to-day life. But I think this most importantly demonstrates something for us to notice. something we haven't seen from Mob's prior explosions. In those moments, he may have exploded with power, always looking amazing. However, he always also seemed to be in control. But this flashback to a traumatic event he shared with his brother shows something else. An instance in time where Mob truly blacks out and someone else takes the wheel. In this scene, the tone shifts. From the shallow philosophical battle that Teru was forcing Mob to engage in to an all-out fight for survival, as Mob loses all control and a distinctly different, almost terror-ridden atmosphere takes hold and refuses to relinquish control until everything before him is left in ruin, flinging Teru, naked, and half the school into the sky above the clouds. When he eventually returns to his senses, he realizes what he's done, cries, and laments the fact that perhaps he hasn't changed since that day after all. From an animation standpoint, episode 5 is absurdly good. This is all from the mind of Kenichi Fujisawa, who storyboarded this, directed it, and was its animation director also. He's one of the big names in the, quote, web gen movement. This movement refers to a young group of people who came up in the mid-2000s learning to animate on tablets and using software like Flash, helping their work feel distinctly different in an industry that even to this day primarily uses pencils and paper for animation. And much like episode 3, there's a distinct focus on movement with character rigidity and model correctness thrown out the window in favor of big idiosyncratic styles, which, as it happens, is a defining cornerstone of web gen animation. And you've seen Fujisawa's work already most likely, having made a name for himself on Naruto, animating one of the most iconic parts of Kakashi vs. Obito, having also taken part in other ambitious projects like Full Metal Alchemist Milo's movie and Space Dandy. Looking at these two productions, he's always been drawn to projects that try to do something different, and Mob fits that billing to a T. And impressively, this was his debut as far as having 100% creative control over the storyboard and animation direction. Tachikawa gave him all of the freedom, and this led to a fight that's extended in length far beyond what the manga initially offered, including hilarious new visual gags. Enjoy. And wonderfully, this demonstrates an understanding for what one said he was hoping the anime would do with his series. I'm sure when he watched this episode, he had a massive dumb smile on his face. In addition to that, the legendary Norio Matsumoto, who many will know for defining so much of battle shonen action in the late 90s and early 2000s, is here. He was a massive influence in Fujisawa's work over the years, which makes the fact that they eventually made friends and joined forces on this project an almost fairy tale-like ending for the duo. And it doesn't even stop there. This episode has so much care and thought put into its production that the quality even seeps into the sound and music design. Mob's theme, entitled Mob's Emotional Explosion, is without a doubt the centerpiece of the entire musical score for this show. So let's try to break it down for a second. Driving the piece is the only trace of percussion you will hear for a lot of the track, a kick drum hitting every single beat. This really propels the entire piece with a sense of energy, almost like a frantic heartbeat. You also have a piano and a synth accompanying this throughout the track, though they are mixed pretty well in favor of the star of the show. That instrument. What even is that? Is it a kazoo? A melodic? What is that? Oh, it's this. This instrument is called a Seamoons. It sounds wrong to say. And by instrument, I guess I really mean robot abomination with artificial lungs and throat capable of making that weird kazoo-like singing we hear. This thing was invented by Meiwa Denki, who was actually the inventor of the automaton. This dude is a literal music Willy Wonka who invents nonsense instruments, as he so calls them. And so Kenji Kawai, the guy behind the OST for Mob Psycho 100, seems to have a particular interest in Seamoons in particular, as this is not even the first time he uses one in his work, and contracted Denki for the production of Mob Psycho 100's score. This instrument brings such an incredibly unique flavor to this piece. There really is a sense of profound power and terror that is conveyed with its musical output, which certainly makes sense given how terrifying the instrument that carves out the song looks. Ritsu and Mob. Having explored what it means to have powers and to use them responsibly, to improve yourself using your own abilities, we find ourselves now delving into a story that contends with the opposite side of that argument. We now know what one ought to pursue if they have powers, but what if they don't? What if their lives are comparatively perfect, but they remain fixated on what they perceive is a lacking in their life? This is the story of Mob and his younger brother Ritsu, and their dynamic in these episodes might be the most compelling element of this entire story so far, because quite simply, they are both characters that don't find value in what makes them intrinsically special, but instead feel worthless by focusing on what they're not. With compliments from his brother Mob like, "Ritsu is much more talented than I am and doesn't do anything weird," ringing like an insult in his younger brother's ears. And because of this attention to detail concerning these characters, when you plop them into this fantastical world and allow the narrative to be driven by them and the believable human choices they make, it not only makes for entertaining reading and watching, but creates a captivating story the likes of which I honestly could not look away from. Early on with Ritsu, I was convinced he was a simple and kind younger brother. However, since then, he has evolved to a comparatively far more complex, believable, jealous, and, well, resentful younger sibling that has far more in common now with his older brother than he might think. Just not in the areas he personally cares for at this moment. Detached from that for a moment, the framing of Onigawara is an interesting way for Ritsu and Shinji to express their non-conforming or authentic selves, so to speak. It's all a balance of those who framed Onigawara leveraging their power, or reputation, to harass and frame someone who comparatively has less social credit. In other words, Ritsu and Shinji in this instance are in this scene making the same mistake and metaphorically doing exactly as Teru did in the last episode, abusing their power with them leveraging their strengths to prevent him from using what he's good at, his fighting. And honestly, a lesser show would stop there and focus on their A-plot, but brilliantly, one offers Onigawara something else. He uses this as a lesson to teach the character, taking this as a signal that, while yes, Onigawara himself, he was wrongfully accused and his name was destroyed by these people wrongfully, it was his lack of care to his other attributes that created the perfect set of dominoes to fall should the correct situation arise. And that's such a subtle, nuanced, and brilliant lesson for someone, a kid, potentially watching this, to take away from this whole show. However, unfortunately, Ritsu, his lesson isn't so easily learned. For once his anguish over not having powers gets the better of him, he soon realizes that he may have powers when he sees for the very first time. What's up, Dimple? As an interesting ruffle to this unfolding story, the surrounding gangs of this greater territory the world of Mob Psycho 100 is set in have bore witness to the terrifying power of Mob, without actually knowing who that in fact was, and this secures the reasonable level of uncertainty that makes the following chapters all the more interesting because, at some point, due to his abuse of power, Ritsu will gain the attention of someone he really isn't ready for. It's Teru, cosplaying as Marge Simpson, I think, or pineapple. Either way, he's not ready for this cat either. But what's awesome is that Teru now stands as a monument to the good that Mob can bring to people. He's completely changed his outlook, and as a reformed man, he recognizes the same sort of trouble appearing in Ritsu, following him all the way down an alleyway where he's confronted by an army of thugs ready to fight who they think is Mob, his brother, and really, this outing here is just to show the progression and downfall of Ritsu, the evolution or progression of his powers, but the downfall of his ideals as a character. The destruction he's wrought on this group of troubled kids is unsettling, and in the eyes of one individual, it's more unsettling than anything else.
うちの弟が怪我をさせてしまって、どうもごめんなさい。今後とも仲良くしてやってください。
I spoke earlier in this video about the two most famous characters one as an author has created in Saitama and Mob respectively, and how they differ from one another while sharing many key parts of how their stories are written in common. However, I think taking a closer look at the fundamental differences between these two now iconic characters will shine a light largely on what substance is at the core of this phenomenal scene and why I believe Mob is, when comparing these two characters, potentially the most relatable. Mob and Saitama are most different in that they are driven by different themes around their similar situations. They are both wildly strong characters that dwarf everyone around them. Neither are particularly intelligent and have to of course contend with the mundanity of life despite their supernatural abilities. However, at his core, Saitama from One Punch Man is ultimately an exploration into the question, if you manage to become great or the best, then what? What more is there? Delving into the practical and emotional consequences of achieving exactly what you set out to achieve. In other words, in the specific case of Saitama's, is being better than everyone else worth it? On the flip side, through the character of Mob, he is an exploration of what the best even means in the first place. Does being the best or strongest psychic of all time matter if you're miserable and can't make friends? And to that same end, considering the point of view of Ritsu, does being the most academically successful or popular kid at school matter if you can't do what you want? In Ritsu's case, it's being psychic, but this question can easily be posed to anyone and highlight their weaknesses, whether they be getting good grades, doing well in sports, or what have you. The dichotomy of what people have versus what they want, with the potential results or findings of that thesis being that there isn't a best thing to be good at. Because, as Mob has gone to great lengths to explain, being special at one thing doesn't make you any better of a person than the man next to you who sucks at that. This, as I alluded to earlier, is highlighted in Mob's heart-to-heart with his brother in episode 4 and further reinforced through his battle with Teru. In other words, Mob is forced to grapple with and evolve from the cards he has been dealt in life. It just so happens that hand he's been dealt is being the absolute best psychic of all time and sucking complete ass at literally everything else. And I think it's for that very reason why Mob resonates with those that take the time to watch this series so easily. A sense of connection is formed to the character of Mob that I think is even stronger than that which One Punch Man establishes, simply because that theme that Mob himself as a character represents is so much more relatable. Every single one of us has something that we believe we are exceptionally good at, and we all have aspects about ourselves that we find deeply unsatisfactory. Finding our personal worth among those elements is so hard, but Mob is living proof that pushing yourself outside of your comfort zone to strive for goals that don't come easy to improve yourself are always worth it. And this is what I love about one's writing. On its face, it presents as a gag manga with little else to be expected from it aside from some supremely well-crafted comedy. But when you least expect it to, it can profoundly reach across the screen and give you a wonderfully emotional and enriching experience, the likes of which are seldom seen in this genre. This fight for the fate of Ritsu is utterly and dumbfoundingly gorgeous. The movement, the framing, the dramatic camera work, the awesomeness that Mob is emanating with the greatest of ease is spectacular, and interestingly, this scene brought to my attention something I honestly should have noticed sooner. Mechanically, Mob's action scenes are fun for the same reasons Gohan's action scenes are in early Dragon Ball Z. They are both innocent and unassuming characters that want nothing more than a peaceful resolution, driven to a breaking point they didn't want to reach before finally erupting in an incredible show of force. Even some of the framing of Mob in this scene feels reminiscent of Dragon Ball Z at times to me, which is more than okay. However, for the first time in this series, Mob has a lot more on his table here than might meet the eye, and due to that, we're shown a side of him that we've only seen once before, a terrifying set of powers that engulf the thoughtful and kind personality of the young Mob, and in a devastating series of attacks. Heavy and precise ones that border on difficult to look at times, Mob is eventually outsmarted, leaving his unconscious body still animating itself in a further unsettling fashion, struggling for consciousness. Of these 3 episodes that make up this section, there's really only one that possesses animation and direction I felt I needed to touch on, and it's episode 8. It might be my favorite episode, I don't know. And you know what? I'm leaning into the meme. This might be the best episode I've watched in the series so far. After 2 smaller episodes, Mob's insane production value returns in full force, and the show's character designer, Yoshimichi Kameda, takes the reins once again as animation director, with a storyboard that features heavy contributions from the series director, Tachikawa. You can feel Kameda's expert and confident touches all over this episode. From the sketchy line work to the awesome poses, it's unmistakably Kameda. Furthermore, this episode is packed to bursting with an enormous number of insanely talented animators, the extent to which could very well be its own standalone video. But perhaps the most important inclusion here is Bones' superstar, one of the most influential animators to ever exist, with hundreds of people now animating his distinct impact frames and cubic debris. It is, of course, Yutaka Nakamura. It cannot be overstated just how iconic, influential, and immensely talented this man is. Whether you know him by name or not, you've no doubt seen him in shows like My Hero Academia and One Punch Man, and go further back and you'll see him in Cowboy Bebop. Heck, you might even have seen scenes that you thought were him, but were in fact just inspired by his legendary work. Nakamura's scene in this episode is absurd. Not only is he drawing insane character motion, but the guy's also animating building exteriors and interiors. There's such a wonderful sense of momentum and weight to his movements that elevates this scene to heights they otherwise wouldn't reach without him. He's a master of his craft in full force in this episode, which, after Mob, Dimple, and Terror ready themselves to retrieve Ritsu from the clutches of this evil organization of proficient psychics, sets up nicely for the final but incredible arc of this season. Claw. Let me tell you, while I absolutely loved every single episode in this season, nothing could have prepared me for how remarkable this last stretch of episodes was. With the introduction of the Claw 7th Division, the stakes are immediately raised. We've spent the entire show so far feeling safe because we know that Mob is there and stronger than anyone else. But the situation we find ourselves in now is unlike anything we've come across before. This group of powerful, evil adult psychics has kidnapped Ritsu as well as all of the Awakening Lab kids, and Mob is not there to squash the baddies before any harm can come to them. Of course, it doesn't take long before Mob and Tero come face to face with one of Claw's bosses, and 12 seconds of child-sanctioned waterboarding later, they have all they need to head to Claw HQ, except they don't seem to believe any of the info that Claw boss has given up, and watching this guy dangle upside down, completely failing to explain that he has told them effectively everything already, is so damn funny and really highlights another one of the strong suits of this show: the sound design. All of the sound design around every punch, kick, and use of psychic ability works to deliver the adaptation in a convincing and gripping manner. But I think one aspect that really shines above the rest here is the use of a sound effect to elevate a certain element of the show. The cowbell that strikes as we are shown updates on Mob's percentage is a recurring example, but the way that they are used to highlight the comedy really cannot be understated either. The hard cut to the perplexed Claw boss with the bell sound effect ringing out has got to be one of the hardest laughs I have got from the entire show. Little touches like that are throughout the sound work in the anime, and I think it's a worse show without them. While various Mob and Tero hijinks are going on, we are treated to Ritsu and Ko being locked up by easily the scariest Claw member of the bunch. I mean, seriously, Jesus, this guy's face and voice are something I wish I could go back and unsee, and unhear. The entire sequence is honestly so very chilling to watch, and it's actually the first time we've seen any harm actually come to the humans in this show, much less a kid. And with it, we see the return of our beloved paint-on-glass animator Mio Sato to really drive home the chilling nature of it all. But from this, we get what I think is probably the best Ritsu moment of the entire season. Once Daichi, the other circle-headed twin, lets everyone know that his brother's death was actually just a psychic illusion, Ritsu takes to concocting an actual escape plan. And this escape really highlights so many of my favorite elements of these final episodes, because it's not Ritsu's new psychic powers, the ones that he's been painfully longing for his entire life, that saves the day here. Well, not completely at least. It's his natural talents, his cunning intelligence and social skills that allows him to utilize every single kid there and execute a flawless escape plan. It didn't matter how strong he'd become, what saved the day in the end was what made him unique from the get-go. And that's really the theme that stays with us for the rest of this season. Once Mob, Tero, and Dimple, who is now possessing some poor Claw crony, make their way inside Claw HQ, they are quickly met by Koyama, aka the lip ring guy that fought Mob and kidnapped Ritsu in the first place. And let me just say, as soon as I saw this rematch lined up, man, I was prepared. I was ready for another epic Mob throwdown. Except, yeah, yikes. None of them are messing around. In fact, the entire episode revolves around Mob and crew splitting up in search of Ritsu, and man, is that episode fun. This entire mini-arc has so much more of an ensemble cast feel to it than anything we've seen so far, and it's just a blast to watch as we bounce back and forth between Dimple and his stolen body shenanigans, Teru competently dealing with the terrifying espers sent his way, and Mob, well, we actually don't get to see much of Mob fighting, in fact. These poor Claw bosses are up against Mob with no concern for holding back, so most of them don't even last long enough to warrant being defeated on screen, apparently. And honestly, seeing Mob completely and utterly decimate everyone in front of him isn't even really scary at this point. It's almost euphoric. A major drive of this entire story thus far has been the slow buildup of Mob's emotions and power over time, the small bits of release as he explodes. But now we are getting to see him cut loose. And damn if there isn't something satisfying about just one-shotting every single scar he comes up against. Playing even more into that ensemble cast element, both Dimple and Teru end up running into their own scars to deal with. Teru runs up against Miyagawa, a full-blown pyrotechnic who actually manages to put Teru against the ropes by engulfing him in flames. Hironori Tanaka, who many people might know from Chainsaw Man's crazy third episode, tackles the brunt of this action sequence, and man, is it an absolute treat. You'd almost sweat just looking at it. Dimple similarly runs into Matsuo, another scar who keeps powerful pet spirits to eviscerate his foes. And all of this bouncing back and forth between fights creates within these episodes an almost monster of the week type vibe, with the wide variety of enemies offered up to us all at once. There is, however, definitely a bit of an uneasy feeling in these fights, as just the same way Ritsu and co are in the enemy territory absent of Mob's protection, so too now are Dimple and Teru. And while we do have decent confidence in their strengths and abilities, there is still this creeping feeling of danger as they face increasingly stronger foes alone. Because, as we've been reminded time and again throughout this series, the full weight of this mission's success rests on whether or not Mob can win the day. The rest of them, in our eyes, can help, but they also just need to survive. Dimple's fight with Matsuo is definitely the first and most prominent example of this, as he is largely outgunned and outmatched against these full-power spirits he's up against. Dimple is such an incredibly enjoyable character to watch, so seeing him manage to outwit his enemies by possessing, unpossessing, and then repossessing his borrowed body to get the enemy away from him is a whole lot of fun, but expertly plays into this character. At least until we learn that Matsuo has more pets still and seals Dimple away in a jar crammed full of the hungry bunch. And with that momentum shift, so too is Teru also taken out by a tag team of claws that catch him off guard. It's at this point the stress noticeably starts to build in the story, and so as not only Dimple and Teru are both captured, but Ritsu and company also run into and are swiftly taken out by Sho, a powerful young psychic who apparently isn't even a member of Claw's 7th Division, but a visiting intern? What's this kid's deal anyway? I don't know. I'm sure it won't matter later on. As the episode heads towards a close and Mob dispatches yet another few scars both on and off screen, he also discovers and knocked out Ritsu on the ground following his fight with Sho. At this point, the light-hearted bad guy swatting vibe of the mini-arc comes to an end, and in its place is a very real, palpable sense of terror. Already grappling with a crippling sense of grief and depression, Mob is ambushed by the same Claw member that showed the Awakening Lab crew visions of their member's death, and in that very same way, he shows Mob visions of Ritsu's terrifying, graphic, bloody demise. Mob has dealt with a lot of stress in this season so far. Much of it has been too much for him to take, and has resulted in the incredible yet terrifying explosions we are now accustomed to seeing. But this one is different. As the percentiles struggle to avoid reaching 100%, the climax is not one of rage or even furious violence. It is something entirely different as we see flashed on screen rejection. Mob, perhaps out of pure subconscious defense, completely rejects what he is seeing and reflects all of his fear, remorse, stress, and power back onto Muto, leaving both him and Mob completely unconscious and injured. The scream that Mob lets out here is without a doubt my favorite bit of acting in the entire season. His scream and the way it is mixed and layered is so raw and chilling. It blows me away every single time I take a look at it. And with that, the stage is set. The Awakening Lab kids, Dimple, every single one of our protagonists are defeated or unconscious. Locked away in a room that inhibits all psychic powers, there is no one left, and certainly no one strong enough to take down Claw. They've lost. Reigen? Oh yeah, Reigen's here!
Say the line!
Mark.
This episode is the best Mob episode I've ever seen. It fires on all cylinders, delivering every single element of the series flawlessly. And it's all because of one man, Reigen Arataka, the greatest psychic to ever live. I mentioned this before, but Reigen is unlike any character I've ever seen in anime. Sure, there are other characters that have a similar vibe of fake it till you make it. I mean, Mr. Satan, hell, even King from One's own One Punch Man is, but Reigen is different because, as this episode makes abundantly clear, to the surprise of every single viewer, Reigen is the real deal. Not in that he was harboring supreme powers of any description, no. It's actually something we've seen from the start, that Reigen is really, really good at talking. Reigen is as good at talking, arguing, and convincing people as Mob is at being a psychic. And in truth, even though this is the second to last episode of the season, this episode is, in fact, the climax of the story. And in this grand finale that is later packed with tension, action, and emotional climaxes, the first half of the episode is composed almost exclusively of Reigen making me laugh out loud. I'm a grown man sitting in my living room, laughing at my TV for like 15 minutes straight at an anime character inadvertently convincing an entire evil organization he is their leader by accident. This show, man, this show is perfect. With everyone defeated and locked away, Reigen arrives on the scene by following Mob's phone GPS coordinates because, of course he is, and as he waltzes up to the brigade of Claw cronies at the door, it doesn't take long before his confidence and blunt nature has managed to convince the entire group that he is, in fact, the leader of Claw. And as he's escorted in, he then stops the Claw grunts from attacking the discovered awakening kids by letting them know that kidnapping kids and being violent is wrong. And again, the level of catharsis I felt watching Reigen just completely own this entire organization with his words and confidence alone rivals the feeling of watching Mob one-shot someone. And once Reigen reaches where Mob is being held, he quickly dismisses all the grunts by explaining to them that what they are doing is actually a crime, and they're off on their merry way. What's that you say? I've only been talking about Reigen for the last 3 minutes? Correct! What's your point? In seriousness though, the back half of this episode is somehow even more remarkable than the first, as Reigen and Mob finally run into the remaining Claw scars. Spirit Pokemon trainer, Nappa, samurai businessman, and tiny gas mask girl, who is the leader of Claw's 7th division somehow. And so begins the true central conflict of the rest of the season. In a show so jam-packed with action, comedy, wonderful bits of animation, every single element that can be going for a show like this, the true conflict of this final mini-arc isn't a big cinematic fight. It isn't Mob hitting 100% and destroying everything in his path. Rather, it is Reigen wanting to make sure that Mob knows using powers against others is wrong. With 4 separate scars directly threatening the lives of his mentor, family, and friends, Mob is so desperately backed into the corner of being an anime protagonist and fighting back, but despite all of that, Reigen continues to insist that Mob shouldn't. I find this core emotional conflict so enthralling, and not at all what I expected going into this show. We all know that Mob could wipe all 4 of these people off the face of the earth without so much as a second thought, but should he? He's just a kid, a literal middle schooler who hasn't even figured out how to get his crush to notice him. So often when we sit and watch shows like this, I think we tend to discount the reality of the situation, rationalizing it away as being necessary or what other choice do they have? But Reigen rejects that entirely. He walks into this arc uninvited, looks us straight in the face and says, "Are you crazy? These are kids." And the hardest part is, it's difficult to say what is right at this point, because yes, Mob is just a kid, but he's a kid who is about to be brutally murdered along with everyone he knows if he doesn't fight back. Does not hurting others with your powers really warrant letting that happen? It's all happening so fast. How is Mob supposed to figure this out? Well, Reigen doesn't really give him a chance to figure it out. While everyone is distracted trying to take Mob out, Reigen whips out another one of his special techniques, this time in the form of a simple drop kick to the leader Ishiguro and punching Muraki in the face, which actually works surprisingly well, at least for long enough to let him talk some more. But unfortunately, Reigen miscalculated here. His plan to knock some sense into these adults and take them out of murdering actual children means nothing when he's up against these people. They aren't really adults. They're practically grown children, stuck in arrested development, still fighting their battles and aiming for their goals with fists and blades. So, with all of them completely ignoring Reigen's words, the big battle of the season commences. And wow, what a battle this is. This entire show is incredibly animated, but perhaps nowhere is that as apparent as these final fights. In fact, by the time this episode was airing, the entire anime had wrapped up its production and completed. Now, that might not sound like all that much of a feat since there's only 1 episode left, but unfortunately, almost all anime are run on a painfully tight schedule. So the fact that this anime managed to wrap up production entirely before its penultimate episode even airs is remarkable to me. This episode also marks the entrance of one of Mob Psycho 100's most prolific names in its production, Hakuyu Go. Tackling multiple long cuts in both of the major fights here, he was 24 years of age when this was made, and had only just joined the industry 2 years prior. I mean, how do you even begin to talk about something like that? The background animation, the effects work, and the Nakamura-esque inspired, full-drawn environments. I mean, it's just absurd. 24 years old, let me remind you. And while I haven't watched it yet, it is my understanding that he is here to stay going forward with Mob Psycho as an absolute powerhouse of a contributor to this production. As the fights continue to progress, Teru, Ritsu, and Reigen continue to lose ground and become more in danger, as Teru continues to call out Mob, begging him to fight back for real to save them all. Insurmountable pressure then starts to build. With each blow traded in the background, Mob's stress and conviction grows further. If he doesn't do something, they're all going to die. Reigen desperately pleads to Mob to not fight back. But they can't run. They're all fending off deadly attacks from powerful psychics. Reigen pleads one last time, don't fight against someone with murderous intent. From all of this, with nowhere else to turn, no choices left to make, Mob is backed into a corner, and as Miyosato's absolutely remarkable painting glass animation returns once again, Mob makes his choice.
やめとけモブ、お前が苦しくなるだけだ。嫌な時はな、逃げたっていいんだよ。
This moment is genuinely, for me, the climax of the entire season. The hard cut from the build-up of the music and visuals surrounding Mob's rage and acceptance of murderous intent to Reigen smacking him in the face and setting him straight is absolutely flawless. Every single element presented to us indicates that we were about to see Mob completely cut loose and showcase all of his powers to us in a fantastic demonstration of raw power and rage. I mean, it's nearing the climax of the anime. Of course it will. And there's plenty of precedent set for this to create our anticipation. But with one slap from Reigen, every single element of this anticipation is hard cut away from in a single frame. Reigen has managed to cut through all of this and get it through to Mob and us as an audience, and later the rest of the people in the room, that this is all meaningless violence and not how children should act. The entire scene is so incredibly subversive of what you would expect from an anime, and the audio and visuals execute on that completely flawlessly. What a show! It is such a shocking, beautiful piece of television, and it couldn't have concluded any other way, really. Every single action in this entire season, every character conflict surrounding Mob, every piece of Reigen wackiness, it all comes collapsing in on a singular moment and the flashback that follows. We see the very first time that Mob meets Reigen, and Reigen plainly lays out the central thesis of this entire season. Just because you have psychic powers doesn't make you any less human. The same goes for people who can run fast, or are smart, or even who stink. We all have characteristics that define us, and in the end, they are not what define us. What matters is embracing who you are, being kind to others, and becoming a good person. What a powerful theme. What an incredible message. Not just for the child in distress here, but for all of us.
師匠!
Much to my surprise, the beginning of the final episode doesn't begin with a giant Mob explosion, but rather a quiet realization that Mob doesn't have to fight, that running is also an option. At which point, Reigen leaps up from the ground, scolding the swordsman for trying to hurt him with a toy sword. What? Well, as we quickly begin to realize, it would appear in the stress and emotional release of the moment prior, Mob inadvertently projected his 100%, or should I say 1000% power into Reigen in sort of a flight or fight response, and boy, oh boy, does Reigen put it to good use. What follows is a highly entertaining sequence of Reigen shenanigans completely dismantling the psyches and beliefs of these scars. This power trip is so fun to watch, and at this point, Reigen might as well be the main character. And once again, he manages to utterly blindside me by putting into perspective what is actually happening here. These people that think that they're special, capable of ruling the world with their strength, but they're not. Everyone is good at something. Being a strong psychic isn't going to make them popular. Hurting others isn't going to fix Sakurai the swordsman's traumatic childhood of dead parents and foster home abuse. In fact, as Reigen describes, he too had a tragic childhood.
こいつ、俺と同じ。
One time, he was young. He forgot to tell his parents that it was sports day at school, so he didn't have anything to eat for lunch that particular day. Despite the insanity of all of this, Reigen seems to manage to convince all of the claws. Though it was Mob's power that facilitated his actions, it was actually his approach and charisma that made the difference. All but their leader Ishiguro, who, as it turns out, is, oh dear god, he's a wrinkly old man. Make it go away. With Reigen's powers run out and Mob exhausted, Ishiguro's final tantrum would surely spell doom for them all, if it wasn't for the fact that the climax happened last episode, that is. So, as it happens, Sho, that intern kid from a few episodes back, is actually the Claw's leader's kid and was checking up on the 7th Division the entire time, promptly putting an end to Ishiguro and caps off the combat. Disappointed, however, in Mob's decision to run. The rest of this episode is a sequence of really cozy tie-ups and check-ins on all of our characters. Mob is glad to be back at school with his crush, the gym bros continue to be sick as all hell, and Teru is ready to lead the Awakening Lab kids onto higher highs. Reigen, able to see Dimple now, is happy to have another helper at his side, and looming over the distance, Claw's leader seems to approach. If it isn't clear already, I think this resolution, this arc, and well, really this whole season are utterly brilliant. Those of you who watch my channel often enough know that I'm not always this positive about the works that I watch or read, but there is a reason I am now. This show delivers on every possible front. The story, animation, music, sound design, compositing, editing, storyboarding, everything is working in tandem to bring you this wonderful story and characters in the best way it possibly can. And the story that we do get, in the end, is 100% worth that Herculean effort. I have watched a lot of anime and read a lot of manga for this channel, as well as in my personal time across my whole life. Some I've liked, some not so much, but it has been quite some time since I so deeply enjoyed watching an anime like this. The characters and themes it delivers are remarkably genuine, thoughtful, and enthralling, and I can't wait for what Season 2 has in store for me. In the end, the core motivation behind my wanting to explore this series in greater detail was that I wanted to try to make sense of why or how someone like One became successful as a mangaka. Over the years in reviewing these stories from the East, my aim has been to uncover the footprints or fingerprints each and every artist invariably leaves on their work as I read them. Whether it be the rebellious nature of Araki in JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, the pain and anguish left behind by Togashi in Hunter x Hunter, or even the initially sad but inspirational journey of Kishimoto through the likes of his Naruto series. Normally, people tend to have a superficial reaction to one's work because of how it looks on the surface. More so than any other successful mangaka out there, one's work tends to be initially dismissed, with those that are not open to understanding how it reads or how his work works, making up a common part of one's experience trying to make it as an artist in this industry. However, true to the lessons he's learned and almost exactly like the stories he's written, the crude-looking mangas and the silly stories he presents often have far more going on right beneath the surface than one might expect. But once you do notice it, that's the moment that one not only wins you over as a fan, but potentially, if you're lucky, changes your outlook and approach to life for the better. And so, before I finish this episode, I'd like to share a quote with you. Nearing the end of a particular conversation, an interviewer says what he takes away from Mob Psycho 100 is that you can't truly grow up without interacting with other people, further adding that he doesn't recall any other manga that puts so much care into depicting one's own personal growth. In response to these observations, One explains his approach towards Mob Psycho 100. What I have in mind is to tell a big story of one little step. I don't believe our lives change completely for the better at a short notice. It's all the small progress we make that's important. That's what I think while drawing this manga. Episode 1. I love this episode, guys. I mean, really, really loved it. Something that I think is often lost when stories become more complicated, layered, and involve numerous characters is the simple heart at the core of a very particular set of ideas, and in this case, episode. I've pointed this out before, but One, the author of this story I'm reviewing, has the ability to write incredibly resonant and raw emotional scenes, the likes of which will not just take you off guard, but will leave you reeling and mulling over what you have just seen for days to come. This is such an episode, and honestly, episodes like this don't come around every day. In the case of One Punch Man's Moomin Rider versus the Deep Sea King scene, the character is presented as a joke in all of the episodes that featured prior. Someone delusional or perhaps propelled by ego into dangerous situations within which he has no chance of survival. One paints him with this brush because he wants to shine a light on not just who he is, but the greater message of the series at hand. In the world of One Punch Man, the conflict of interest that exists within hero society has created boastful, egocentric, or simply misguided heroes, the likes of which have lost sight of what makes a hero, well, a hero. And as Moomin Rider comically cycles to the scene of the greatest threat we've yet seen in the series up until this point, we anticipate failure in spectacular fashion, brought about by perhaps, as I said, his own ego or boastful nature. And while our expectations for the conclusion to this interaction were correct, with him losing in spectacularly one-sided fashion, the feeling it left us with was decidedly unexpected. For when no one else could, for the cowering crowd of men, women, and little children, if only to buy them a moment of reassurance, Moomin Rider stepped up to the plate, without hesitation, stared death in the eye, and dared him to blink. And in the end, while not achieving much of a result, without that initial sacrifice from Moomin Rider, Saitama, the person who does eventually save the day, might not have had the time to arrive on the scene. So in that instance, wanting to do the right thing saved countless lives. It highlighted what was, in this society, the making of a true hero, and Saitama recognizes this. The opening episode of Mob Psycho's second season plays on a similar expectation from its audience, however reverses the perspective of a few elements. Though the same shock and awe emotional effect is achieved, I think, perhaps even more effectively than the last in my estimation because it's more relatable. Love is a topic often left unexplored in a lot of these stories that I've read personally, but when it is attempted, it becomes the topic of my fascination. Because in these stories that so often deal with a coming of age, love is one of the most crucial pillars to get right in that narrative. And I think Mob, while not necessarily dealing with love directly in this episode, did deal with the broader concept of relationships. The heartbreak found in them, the fear, the nerves, and ultimately the betrayal. All linking back to the core foundations of this series and indeed the character of Mob himself, choosing instead to be kind in the face of everything horrible everyone has done toward him unjustly. The basic outline of this episode sees a young girl ask out Mob after he embarrasses himself on stage in front of his school. Mob feels taken off guard, but eventually starts to feel good about it and, well, himself. Clumsy as he is through this area of his life, she shares with him parts of herself through her writing, and then she breaks up with him, citing that everything that happened between them was just a dare that she had to accept, and ultimately it was a joke. I think anyone of any gender or denomination can feel the hurt for Mob in this instance, and that universally felt sense of hurt is exactly what makes this scene and his actions that follow so seismically powerful. In creating a character like Mob, who is scared of most things conventional and certainly isn't skilled in any of the adjacent areas, one also created the perfect character to be brave.
やめなよ頑張って書いた小説を破くなんてひどいよ
This gave me chills, and honestly, I've got goosebumps just talking about it. And for a story that is rooted in the fantastical and the grand, this small moment shared between two people is the most my soul has enjoyed this series. With Mob not just stepping outside of his comfort zone, but also opening up to show a piece of his authentic self to someone who moments earlier rejected and embarrassed him. That, my friends, is another hero. The musical track composed for Mob fixing Emmy's book, aptly titled Mob's Kindness, is so incredibly wonderful. The track starts with glockenspiel, recorder, and kalimba at the forefront. All instruments that are wonderfully sweet and generally pretty simple. All instruments that could be played by children. It really gets across this sense of childlike sweetness and wonder, meekness and compassion that Mob demonstrates. Then, as Mob decides to use his psychic abilities in front of Emmy to help her, the chorus of strings come in an absolutely beautiful crescendo of radiance and emotion. This track, paired with the awesome storyboard and the absolutely astoundingly sensational animation, really goes a long way in selling what a sweet and genuine soul Mob is, with his kindness and meekness no longer seen as faults, but instead assets. Episode 2 and 3. When it comes to animation for this season, the level of quality is evident for all to see. Returning to lead the series, we find Tachikawa and Kameda as the character designer. However, this time Kameda has taken on the role of Chief Animation Supervisor. What is Chief Animation Supervisor, I hear many of you asking? Well, unlike a regular animation supervisor who leads the animation direction in an individual episode, a Chief Animation Supervisor provides those corrections across every single episode, across the season. It's very demanding stuff, and for this reason, it's a role Kameda didn't want to take in Season 1, fearing it might compromise his ability to do his own episodes. However, it doesn't seem to have affected much as he handles Episode 2 himself uncompromised. And my long-winded talk about Episode 1 aside, what I'm trying to get across is that while last season dealt with a lot of exploring what Mob's power meant to him and others, this season focuses a lot more on, honestly, a much more interesting aspect to the series: the inner development of Mob himself. Through the flings he shares, the conflicts of interest he encounters, and the existential crises that manifest before and all around the young man. If nothing else, this story about a young, gifted individual in middle school tells the tale of pretty much every single one of us. These years were a transformative time in our lives where we take the first real steps to becoming the people we're going to be for the rest of our lives. And knowing this, the author one leverages the fantastical elements of his world to explore the very volatile part but mundane aspects of our lives in ways that amplify it for us all to take notice and understand. And while I enjoyed what this episode opened us up to with regards characters and world building by introducing us to a new friendly, it was episode 3's focus on the inner conflict and development of Mob that really captured my interest. All in all, the episode deals with what is, for all intents and purposes, a regular few days as an employee of Reigen after he sets up his hilariously terrible website. In the first season, by and large, there wasn't a huge focus on complex enemies with complicated motivations in the spirit world, at least not in the same way that this episode contends with. Early on, after apprehending a stalker that manipulated his spirit-wielding powers, it becomes apparent to Reigen that Mob has changed or is changing, voicing his opinions openly, questioning various aspects of his job and his actions in an ethical light. It's great seeing Reigen act as this father figure to Mob, perceptive to his feelings and his needs, but it's the ending that presents Mob with a dilemma the likes of which he'd never contended with before.
やめてください。私たち3人は家族なんです。
In this episode, it's the human characters that are shown instead as reprehensible alongside the spirits who just want to live a peaceful existence. Quote, "I'm not forcing you, it's okay to listen to your feelings," Reigen says to Mob. And it's this conflict of interest, this sudden shift in perspective that cuts to Mob's core as a character. It's a brilliant episode and one that Reigen wholeheartedly sides with Mob on, because he's always got his back, and I kind of love that. However, the closing sentiments of this episode speak to the possibilities that might lie ahead of Mob himself if things don't go well, for he fears that if he did go rogue or did the wrong thing, there'd be no one who could stop him. That no matter what way he looks at the world, no matter how bad he is at leading or taking charge or making decisions, the buck stops at him, because ultimately he's the only one with the power to make that difference. It's a very sobering thought indeed for the episode to close on, and one that leads us perfectly into Episodes 4 and 5. Similarly in structure to the first season, Episodes 4 and 5 play host to the first multi-episode story that concerns our heroes, with the first 3 acting as sort of standalone tales that reinforce the themes we'll be talking about henceforth. Episodes 4 and 5 contend with really what is an interesting but straightforward premise. A rich guy gathers every psychic he can to help his daughter out of some sort of possession through exorcism or something. And I was really excited to see what sort of story would manifest from such a simple premise, and I wasn't disappointed. Firstly, on a music front, the track titled Release or Restraint that plays in episode 4 around the 9-minute mark is compositionally and contextually pretty interesting, but moreover acts as the musical representation of the scene at hand. It starts off as this genuinely creepy and unnerving piece as various timbres of piano play over a soft, sustaining synth. It very much does its job at giving us this creepy vibe for the mystery ghost that's possessing this young girl, but as the scene goes on and abruptly switches to the POV of the ghost itself and his boredom of dumb hack psychics, the music transitions to this off-kilter faux comedy music. A sloppily played trombone comes in over the top of the piano that is still playing from the earlier section, and purposefully offbeat drums are introduced. These weirder elements that are added give the POV shift this sense of everyone here is irrelevant compared to this ghost feel, while also maintaining a sense of creepiness and dread as the piano element from the beginning of the track remains at the core of the piece, just like the possessed girl remains the centerpiece of her scene despite being surrounded by irrelevant wannabe psychics. I love music stuff like that. It tells a story if you really pay attention, and it's honestly brilliant. After this, there's a nice character moment for Reigen, winning the rock, paper, scissors, but actually gets something out of the young girl that outs her as a demon possessing a host immediately, rather than beating around the bush with her lies and such. Amidst all of these fakes and legitimate psychics, up until Mob engages, Reigen is pretty much the only one to get anything of substance from the situation, with the only meaningful impact anyone else makes coming in the form of them acting as a host for the possessor to communicate to the greater group. I love how the author, makes Reigen so damn cool at every opportunity he has, and even when he's gotten the upper hand on, it's after landing an hilariously awesome knee strike of all things. We quickly learn that Mogami Keiji is a famed psychic of the 20th century and has possessed this little girl. Dimple has history with him but managed to escape, but that's sort of secondary. The real thing that I want to kind of focus on is that things get out of hand quickly. For the first time, Mob can't stop the bad things from happening at his will. He's not strong enough, or at least the gap between Mob and Keiji isn't so significant that Mob can gain the upper hand easily. Keiji beats up the crowd at will. Mob eventually steps in a more serious fashion, and all that exploration into Mob being more introspective and less meek translates nicely into him assessing the situation here and taking it seriously from the onset. He even uses techniques he learned from prior episodes in this season, like that which the Stalker in episode 3 used.
Back at me.
This is awesome. Between Reigen, Mob's maturity, and even Dimple's fucking crazy heroics, this episode 4 is filled with brilliantly authentic character moments. When Mob eventually meets Keiji in a plane of existence that depicts them how they see themselves, it's interesting, to me at least, how Mob's form is depicted then. Keiji looks normal, as Mob says, but Mob himself seems, I don't know, a little exposed. And I think exposed is a great word here, perhaps indicative of the fact that he's not entirely comfortable exposing his powers and by extension himself in moments like this. A moment that quickly turns into a nightmare as Keiji casts Mob into an illusion, one where his powers no longer exist. If you thought I liked episode 4, episode 5 is a full-blown existential crisis that I've been thinking about since I first finished the episode, placing our little hero in a world filled with hurt and depression, trying desperately to force Mob to grow resentful through a sense of injustice and powerlessness. This episode is a fever dream, or should I say nightmare, with the only little tidbits that keep me hopeful are the pieces of dialogue Reigen offers during this madness when we get glimpses into the outside. He says, Mob is someone who can solve things on his own. He actually has strength, unlike me. To hear someone like Reigen say that, it's brilliant. I smile ear to ear hearing him say things like this. The way this nightmare is depicted is horrifyingly familiar and all too real. And honestly, it all feels kind of like a dreamscape or a nightmarescape depending on your persuasion. In the dreams we all experience, we often go through moments of intense realism only to suddenly shift and switch scenes without really noticing ourselves. All the way to extreme surreal visuals. And this particular illusion that Mob's in is no different. Out of everything that's been directed in the prior season and thus far in this one, this episode is the one that I think has the best combination of captivating boards that are married to the themes of what drives this story forward. Watching as Mob is robbed of every ray of light he's managed to cultivate in his life, all replaced with sorrow and hurt, is soul crushing to see unfold. Worse again when this emotional and physical torture begins to manifest in a fashion that Keiji is looking for. Resentment, revenge, all of these horrible traits that Mob has actively made sure were not part of his life before suddenly come boiling to the top. Oi. Leave it to Dimple to remind Mob of who he is and how far he's come. You couldn't get a better physical representation of what Mob offers a human being, or in this case spirit, in this series. The individual that has changed the most in this series, funnily enough, has been Dimple, and in this episode it's emphasized that it's been through Mob's example. He was flattered that Mob would trust him with something as precious as his body in the first place, and interestingly, there's virtually no music in the first part of this episode, I noticed. And that has to be a 100% purposeful choice, as the lack of music really helps sell this sense of emptiness and isolation Mob experiences as he navigates the fictional world Keiji has created before him. Having come to his senses, Mob finally delivers perhaps the best line of the episode. The Shigeo you fabricated might succumb to you, but I won't. I'm not going to run. He's not the helpless, joyless, and friendless person Keiji wanted him to think he was. He knows he's more than that and can blaze his own trail, command his own destiny, and moreover, because he's the one with the power that can stop him, he will. But to be honest, the episode is known for one thing, and honestly, I wouldn't be surprised if it was only known for one thing only. I can talk about the story and the music all I want, but if I don't talk about the breathtaking animation on display that takes place after here, I won't be doing my job correctly. Episode 5 is unfathomably incredible, to the point of being enough to fill 30 minutes of video on its own. I mentioned Hakuya Go in Season 1's video for his incredible animation in Episode 11 and noted that he was a remarkably young prodigy, and since that first season up until this episode, he had worked on Episode 22 of Fate Apocrypha, boarding, directing, and leading the animation, resulting in one of the most astounding action episodes of anime maybe ever. It was an industry-wide event upon release, with every animator and director under the sun talking about it. And that's important because he quite literally does it again here, and with arguably more nuance and finesse. The first half of the episode is introspective, and he opted to use a cinematic aspect ratio to create a feeling of otherworldliness, with a heaping load of layouts that emphasizes Mob's loneliness. We even get creepy looking angles like this dotted across the episode to allude or hint towards Keiji's ever-present watchful eye. Typically, an anime episode will have a production assistant credited, and part of their role is to assemble staff for an episode. In this episode, everyone was brought together through Go's connections exclusively, and as a result, there is no production assistant credit, which I think is kind of amazing. On the storyboard front, we have an incredible Toei affiliate in the form of Masami Mori, who many will know for One Piece. Here he draws the most ludicrous effects-driven sequence with insane fabric work. He's pretty well known for his drawings of funny stick insect characters, which is plain to see in this other scene on the episode. And honestly, there are far too many animators to highlight in this first half alone, but if I had to highlight just one more, this specific highlight comes from Takuji Miyamoto. Someone mentioned briefly in Season 1, but who really comes alive here. He's a student of Shinya Ohira, a legendary expressionist animator many will recognize from the Animatrix, and that very DNA can be found here in this insanely loose and rapping scene. And all of this is amazing, but I haven't even gotten a chance to talk about the action in the second half, and so I'm going to leave the less action-packed stuff behind me for now, because I fear that if I do not, I will be here all day. There's an endless number of all-star animators to talk about, okay? So let's go. Hakuya Go, I touched on him earlier, but in addition to everything he's already offered this episode, he also, somehow, found time to animate this insane sequence. Keiichiro Watanabe is another huge name that's on this list, and he is such for his work on Jujutsu Kaisen and Chainsaw Man recently. And here he goes wild with his effects drawing, creating such a horrifying depiction of these spirits, almost like warping bacteria. It all culminates with the introduction of Weilin Zhang, who animates just the most ludicrous display of effects. This guy is 17 years old. Okay, I'm grabbing my mic. I want to reiterate, he is 17 years old. I don't even know what I was doing at 17. Imagine being this talented and you can't even buy alcohol. His work on Boruto is some of the finest action ever brought to screen. He just can't stop blowing minds wherever he appears. It then all wraps up with character animator extraordinaire Toshiyuki Sato putting together this goosebumps-inducing scene of Inori breaking down. He was also mentioned in Season 1 for emulating one style at the end of the final episode, and yeah, there's just so much subtle brilliance to character acting that I love. Action animation is flashy by design, and by extension receives the lion's share of the praise going around online. But tremendous character animation, being able to capture the emotions of the moment so perfectly, requires a delicate but powerfully skilled touch, the likes of which only the very best of the best can achieve to this degree. And while that will largely do it for the names I'll drop in this episode, it cannot be overstated just how little this even begins to cover the insane, and I do mean insane, amount of talent on display in this episode. And interestingly, this was the first episode of this series to be made and was completed long before it aired due to Heyoku Go being required to leave Japan and head back to Taiwan for mandatory military service, which sounds scary on its face, but apparently he treated it like a holiday, which maybe says more about the working conditions of the Japanese animation industry than anything else I could possibly say henceforth. Episodes 6 and 7. This is a collection of episodes or mini-arc unlike any other in this series I've seen, and because of that I think this is up there as one of the single most important, or some might say best, parts of the Mob Psycho 100 story. It's a pivotal turning point or culmination of where we start out our journey in season 1, episode 1, and moreover, made me cry like when my ex-girlfriend broke up with me, only in a happy way. Okay, that didn't make sense. But this arc definitely makes sense, and another thing that sets this one apart from all the other episodes is that Reigen is the primary character of focus. The main character of the story as we see how he came to be before he and Mob ever met. After a very brief flashback from where Reigen came from in his prior business, we flash forward to present day as Mob is being celebrated by his club for having gotten stronger. And I can see why. To be honest, 35 push-ups is a really solid effort for someone with no athletic ability originally. Seeing him personally reflect on how far he's come and how it's been so long since he was in a friendly group setting like this is equal parts heartbreaking and inspirational. And that's really Mob Psycho in a nutshell. Then, it finally happens. Reigen calls Mob in the middle of a celebration of sorts, right before he had plans to go play karaoke with people. Reigen calls on short notice. And Mob says, for the first time, no to his request initially. And really, this all feels natural after the development Mob has undergone since the very first episode of the series, and the parallels are there to be seen for us to look at, especially now that we can contrast them. With this short notice stuff Reigen has been pulling normally working out great for him. However, this time, despite Mob showing up to bail him out just this once, it results afterwards in the conversation, or should I say, confrontation between the two. And let me tell you, it's as enthralling to watch as you might think. Reigen runs his mouth like he does best, trying to maintain priority in Mob's life for his business, but Mob biting back, if even faintly for the very first time, is more powerful than anything Reigen could lob at him. And when I first got to know these characters in season 1, I was very interested in their dynamic. Theirs is very much a relationship forged on mutual benefit. Mob offers Reigen legitimacy to his business, and Reigen offers Mob someone to spend time with, a friend. However, as Mob grows as a person, what Reigen offers becomes less and less valuable. And that's what I understood after the first episode concluded, with Reigen himself acting as a force that pushes Mob away from things that directly align with his own self-interest, suggesting he not join a club in episode 2 in lieu of focusing all of his attention on his business. But if it was just that simple, I wouldn't be talking about it like I am right now. For Reigen has demonstrated more than once that while he is a con man, he does sincerely care about Mob and his well-being, so there is a tremendous amount of nuance here. But what's interesting about this fact, and indeed these episodes in season 2, is that every instance that Reigen helped Mob in this series, there could always be a metaphorical thread identified that linked that caring behavior to his own self-interest in some way, or at least in a neutral way at the very least. Why go save Mob in the hideout at the end of season 1 and offer him life-changing responsible advice? Well, because he stands to benefit from Mob returning safely from this interaction. Why take Mob's side in the woods with those teens at the beginning of season 2? Well, because it's bad for his business if Mob's heart isn't in it. Why help him in episode 4 and 5 of this season? Well, because he's incentivized to. Now, before I get comments saying that this is a very uncharitable way of looking at it, I agree, it is uncharitable. And I am, of course, not trying to suggest that he didn't want to help Mob simply because he cares about him either. But it's also important to understand that making these caring decisions towards Mob also happened to benefit him personally in the long run. And so, what makes these episodes, in my mind, so fascinating is that it is the very first time Reigen needs to make a 100% altruistic call, one that isn't beneficial to him or even neutral towards his business. In this moment, his advice to Mob should be, go spend time with your friends. But he doesn't say that. Instead, he doesn't focus on what Mob's best interests are. And the best part about this is that Mob notices. And so after a few ill-measured words from Reigen towards Mob, a fissure between these two starts to form. And as time passes, Reigen is the one who feels isolated, not Mob. With this episode showing their respective realities side by side. On one side, Mob has decided to focus on his own personal development, and so he's reaping what he's sown there, seeing all the positive benefits, whereas Reigen just hasn't. It's here he actually realizes that outside of his job as a psychic, he doesn't really have much else to go on. And with a quick peek behind the curtain and a depressing email from his mom offering a window into this sort of existence, he is very much alone. and it's quite sad. Scenes where Mob is doing karaoke with his friends are contrasted harshly with Reigen slumming it in a familiar dive bar at the corner of nowhere. He thinks to himself that he doesn't have friends. The bartender didn't put alcohol in his drink, which is funny because it just reinforced the sort of spiral Reigen is on right now with his reactions as he stumbles and vomits his way out of that particular encounter. Thankfully though, this isn't an entirely sad story, and Reigen uses this moment of isolation as one of clarity instead, choosing to lift himself up and focus on doing what good he can, and by doing so, broadens the scope of his business, gains more fulfillment as a person, and funnily enough, gains wider popularity. This is what personal growth looks like, and eventually, he even gets invited onto television where a familiar guest plans his revenge on Reigen. I think from this episode, the main takeaway is that while being mutually beneficial and providing what the other needed, they also in a way shackled each other to a specific point in their lives, unable to move past that. Mob focusing his attention not on self-improvement and interpersonal relationships, but on Reigen, and Reigen similarly not focusing on bettering himself or changing but staying the same, remaining in comfort. Which rings true to the overall message of Mob Psycho 100's story. If you want to better yourself and grow, you have to step outside of your comfort zone. Both parties in this instance have now done just that, and the results I think speak for themselves. But that doesn't mean that all of that personal growth doesn't unearth something else uncomfortable for Reigen to contend with.
いや除霊も何もこの子取り憑かれてないよね演技じゃん
You know when you're watching something really embarrassing happen to someone on stage live and it makes you feel immeasurably uncomfortable by association? Well, this is the first time something like this has happened to me while watching an anime. This is a fictional character, and I'm fully aware of that, and I was feeling all sorts of ways when I was watching Reigen absolutely humiliate himself as this thing was revealed that he was faking it all along. And this feeling for me happened because of how I feel about Reigen as a character and how he's been built up. A slick talker that can weasel his way out of any situation with his cunning. And seeing all of that bravado crumble around him for the world to see created an incredibly visceral reaction for me as a viewer. This, combined with the public outrage and fallout, as well as his mother's increasingly concerning and intimate emails, it's a phenomenally effective way to immerse us in the circumstances of this character and the forces that are pulling him through the avenues he's pursued. He's trying so desperately to be something that he's not, and during a press conference that he holds, an essay he wrote as a student is exposed, titled, "I Want to Be Somebody." I think that says so much about Reigen's character. It cuts right to the core. As an audience, we know very little about his past, but the little we have garnered from him through the advice that he's offered Mob in the past, good or bad, paints him as someone that didn't attend any clubs after school or really had any meaningful relationships with people. And upon reflection of this, he remembers back to when he was at a crossroads, about to quit being a psychic altogether after just starting. And that's when Mob came into his life.
特別な何かになりたかった。俺はあれから何も変わっていない。あいつをただ利用してきただけ。結局、何にもなれなかった。
This is the moment Reigen recognizes exactly what he was doing to Mob was bad. And in this moment of clarity, contends with correcting what he said to Mob straight to the camera without context. And upon doing so, the conference and the conflict he's facing, both internally and externally, extinguish in spectacular fashion. It's the lie the character holds to be true that once that lie is rectified and acknowledged, suddenly everything becomes much more simple. Only in the case of Mob Psycho 100, it's very visually and physically and literally taken care of right before his eyes. And fittingly, this might be my favorite use of music in the entire season personally. When the entire press conference erupts in psychic powers, it is meant at first viewing to be perplexing and a bit of a mystery as to what exactly is happening. I think it is really clever that for this scene, we get Mob's theme. Or at least we do sort of, with one key difference. The Sea Moon's instrument that leads this entire musical arrangement that we associate with Mob is nearly completely absent, but we can faintly hear it. With it not blaring its trademark creepy melody, I think it still manages to deliver this general sense of psychic powers that we have associated with the track, while also managing to suggest that while Mob is very much doing this, he's not close by any means. And that is of course suggested by the distant and faint sound of the Sea Moon, instrument. And I think that's just super clever. Furthermore, I also think subconsciously it makes us think of Mob right before we see him and Reigen meet following this conference. Which brings me to the final scene of this mini-arc. The climax and culmination of everything these two have been through, and it's utterly perfect. It's moments like this that I personally live for in storytelling. It's why I read, watch, and listen to stories. The fantastical elements of this tale, while captivating and flashy, only act as the canvas for which this intensely emotional and personal story is shared upon. This is as much a story about psychics as The Lion King is a story about lions or The Shawshank Redemption is about prisons. If those were your takeaways from those films, then you have a very shallow interpretation of what those stories are actually about. Mob Psycho 100 is a story about personal growth, friendship, and the expression of these human feelings outwardly. Of course, Mob always knew what Reigen was. Of course, Reigen felt like he needed to lie to Mob to be worthy of his time. And of course, Mob stuck around not for the snake oil Reigen was selling, but instead the shoulder he offered in earnest and the kindness that was so intrinsically part of what makes him, Reigen, a character. His insecurity and his business clouded his judgment, but true to Mob, and who he is, he always has the ability to see things that others can't. In this case, he saw the genuine good person Reigen was, even when Reigen himself didn't see it. And I don't think anything is more true to their dynamic, both literally and metaphorically, than that right there. This final scene of this episode is, for some, the emotional highlight of this entire series. And boy, does this insert song really help to sell the emotion of this scene. The insert song is entitled Grey, sung by Saju no Hana, the singer behind the OP, and it's actually not even the first time we've heard it this season. It was used in episode 1 of this very season at the very end, and I think it's understandable why. In both scenes, it was used to demonstrate the similarity in Mob's incredibly meek, kind spirit and growing emotional maturity. I think the way it is used in this episode in particular is especially fantastic. The way we are hit with the guitar harmonics as Mob tells Reigen he's a genuinely good guy crescendos into the following montage of Reigen and Mob together, and that gives me chills just even writing about it right now. These are my favorite episodes so far. And honestly, it's not even close. We've gone on a wonderfully long and action-packed journey with these two characters, and this for me, this right here, is the resolution to one of the most fundamental aspects of this season. A duo that was once held together by tenuous deceit and codependence now flourishes in a magnificent and lasting friendship built on the foundations of what kept it together partially in the first place. Alright, we're finally here, the final stretch of episodes, and it is distinct from all the others as it's the longest stretch of episodes that contain one mini-arc or tell one solid story. Normally in the show, we're greeted with standalone episodes or couples of 2 or even 4 sometimes at the end of season 1, but this, however, takes up almost half of the arc, and in doing so, delivers what I think has to be the main conclusion to most of Mob's personal development as a character, and really, it acts kind of like the climax of even season 1 and 2 combined. It screams final arc of the series, and yet season 3 somehow exists, which makes me even more curious about that, but I digress. This was a thrilling and intense set of episodes, and fittingly, it kicks off quite the opposite, with an episode that wouldn't look out of place in a slice-of-life anime. Mob wants to place in the top 10 in his school's 5-kilometer race to impress his crush, with some of the highlights in this episode being Reigen taking time off of his work to help Mob with this race. It's wholesome. And on the day at the starting line, he falls, scrapes his knee, and keeps running. And look, it's not pretty, but speaking as someone that sucked at almost every sport in school and then took up running long distance later, I loved this episode and what it kind of said about Mob as a character. The animation of Mob running towards the camera, losing ground only to regain it, is a brilliant way of depicting just how exhausting and mentally draining running long distances is concurrently. And despite not reaching his goal, Mob improved enough such that he was on pace to make the top 70 or so. An enormous improvement on his 291st bottom 10 spot placing from last year. That is if he hadn't passed out. Now, I've never passed out while running, but the level of determination combined with the sheer amount of effort you would need to be exerting to make that happen in the first place, especially during a 5-kilometer race, I can only imagine. Mob is one really tough kid. I can absolutely see what the Body Improvement Club sees in him. It's inspirational, but on that note, this is when the final section turns up the heat.
Yeah. 目を閉じろこれを見るな
It's a tense and troubling event, but one Dimple can thankfully pull him back from. And while he does go full-blown Terminator on everyone until he finds answers, once he does realize that Reigen was a victim as well as all the neighboring psychics, he explains that Mob's parents weren't the ones burning in his home, which brings about the most human reaction from Mob I think I've ever seen in this story. Alright, so as many of you might have gathered during this moment in the story, Mob fainting is sort of a way for one, the author, to build tension before Mob awakening at some opportune moment later in the story. I love stuff like this, but it did make me think back to other parts of this story, and indeed other instances from one's other work, but I'll touch on that a little later. Effectively, this is the point in the story where all the allies and friendships Mob has built over the last 2 seasons start to show what they're made of, and honestly, some of my favorite character moments and scene writing is in here too. I don't want to go over absolutely everything that happens between now and Mob waking up, but I think the scramble to make sure his unconscious body is safe while he rests is hilarious and at times a tense plot device. So let's talk about my 2 favorite moments while Suzuki Toshiro's goons introduce themselves to Teru and everyone gradually. Teru and the rest of the former Scars launch their offensive all the while Reigen waits behind for Mob to wake up. He's been out cold for a while, and this is when intruders force their way into the building and force Reigen to hide with Mob still unconscious. This is perhaps one of the best callbacks to something I barely noticed or remembered from season 1. What an incredible save that only he could pull off. I was certain he and Mob were screwed in this instance, and he even manages to take down the big guy. Uh-oh. Okay, so he wakes up, and the action that ensues with the primary focus being to protect Mob is one of the most infectiously exciting, humorous, and oddly tense scenes in the series. Particularly when Reigen drops Mob, that hulking, massive steroid-fueled insecurity moves to crush him, and
Dimple saves the day by leaping into action to possess Mom's body.
I wasn't expecting this again, and stuff like this, callbacks to prior events and implementations of already explained abilities are exactly the elements that make for terrific surprises and compelling action set pieces. This is such a short but such a brilliant scene I just had to gush about here. Unfortunately though, Dimple's possession does come undone, and flying through the sky, Mob's unconscious body lands in the arms of none other than his gym bro besties. I mean, okay, look, I gotta call a spade here. I cannot deny that something like this happening isn't an astronomically unlikely event to occur and is sort of contrived. What are the odds that they'd be the ones to catch him even if their running route was disrupted? Probably next to impossible. So I have to take points away for that. But this is so fucking awesome! Okay, the best part is, now that everyone has exhausted all of their energies and powers to stop this guy from causing undue harm to Mob, they've all proven themselves, and so we finally get what we've been waiting for. Something I've noticed that's a running trend with One stories is that he orchestrates these grand scenes of struggle between forces of good and evil, but they only seem to exist in the first place either because Saitama or Mob are out of commission or too far away to be involved. It certainly creates anticipation, absolutely, because we're waiting for Mob to join the fight, but I've noticed that it seems to be one of the only aspects of One stories that seems somewhat predictable to me. Heck, Dragon Ball Z did it with Goku and Namek, or a bunch of other times. One Piece has done it with Luffy too. It's a popular shonen trope, but I think they made enough creative choices in between him falling asleep and waking up to justify this choice, in my opinion. This next episode is the first in a series of episodes in which we get to see how different Mob truly is. After all his socializing this season, and all the moments that forced him to mature, with him trying to explain the merits of all walks of life to the Scar Grunts, these moments really echo back to a similar feeling that we got with Reigen in Season 1. Except, despite all odds, I think it hits even harder now, because Reigen always, had that. I'm pretty sure he popped out of the womb confident and convicted, but Mob isn't that way. We've watched him grow from a nervous, socially awkward kid who gets taken advantage of at every turn into a sweet, loving, meek person who has convictions in what he believes. Seeing him preach these values to others completely on his own, it just feels so incredible. Whether it be with these initial lackeys he encounters with the artificial psychic powers, this weird plant man, whether it be by the means of those he previously convinced or those he's currently entangled with in combat, Mob manages to deal with them as passively and with as little actual fighting as he can muster. And that's a wonderful touch, and something you really don't often see in climaxes of stories like this. And perfectly, as we transition from Mob who manages to dispatch these folks without aggressive physical or psychic psychic intervention, we're greeted with this incredible battle between Teru, the ally Scars, and Ritsu versus Shimazaki. The action sequence of all the different psychics trying to use their abilities combined with a very expressive and experimental storyboard make for some of the most compelling action animation I've seen this season. And what's more is, the seemingly untouchable Shimazaki does leave hits through if he doesn't detect them. Perhaps he can't keep track of it all. Either way, Teru notices this, and because of that, Shimazaki targets him.
次は後ろ。あんたの動きも単調になるんだよ。能力に頼りすぎてる。
And once attack after attack after attack on Shimazaki is landed, he still stands, reaffirms control until Mob makes his presence felt. Did I mention that I would marry this show if I wasn't already married? And one look from Mob is enough to send this chicken running, but the best part of all is that while this fight between Sho and his father is happening above atop the tower, Mob starts to walk towards what is no doubt a dangerous situation alone. Unlike One Punch Man, where the drama comes from wondering if Saitama will or will not arrive on the scene on time, Mob can be hurt. And in more ways than one. He has fears, deep-rooted fears that specifically this season of the show has explored. And due to this, I think that makes Toichiro the perfect and most worthwhile villain for Mob to face at the end of this season. And really, the entire series. He exhibits all of the negative traits Mob feared he might one day exhibit if he someday lost control. That's a big theme in this arc. Mob learning when it's okay to fight versus when it isn't. When it's okay to use your gifts versus when it's not. In episode 1, he listened to his heart and used his powers to save something precious for another. In episode 3, he was scared stiff when faced with the reality that he has the power to destroy innocent beings on a whim. And because of that, grew terrified of what he might become if he grew resentful or hateful. Who would stand in his way then? There would be no one to stop him. As a result, he grew untrusting of himself and his powers thereafter. The natural evolution of this idea then came in episodes 4 and 5 when Keiji hijacked Mob's mind and forced him into a series of mind games curated by him to torture that very resentment and yearning for revenge that he had out of him. That Mob himself was worried that he had inside him. But through doing so, through being exposed to all of this torture and resentment and hatred, and with some help from a friend, he realized that he isn't the person Keiji or even he thought he was. He is strong, and the last thing he's going to do is run. And even in episodes 6 and 7, when this evolution in the character became even more apparent and pushed Reigen away, eventually both of them reconciled after growing as people. And now, in the final stretch towards the finish, we've witnessed Mob's evolution. How his fears took hold of him and demonstrated how he overcame each and every one of them, becoming a fine and kind young man in the process, and now standing as the antithesis to what Toichiro represents, a physical, psychopathic representation of Mob's greatest personal worry of who he might become. The stage is set for a clash between two opposing ideals. For just like how Mob has spent his entire life hiding his powers and trying to develop himself beyond that, Toichiro has done precisely the opposite by spending the last 20 years of his life charging psychic energy for one expressed purpose: to take over the entire world, to destroy the lives of billions. In Mob's eyes, he himself is specifically not better than anyone due to his powers, whereas for Toichiro, he thinks himself better specifically because of his powers. He says as much. And so now, leaving all his support system behind, Mob marches towards a terrifying confrontation. A confrontation with what he feared he might one day become, and while doing so insists that his friends and allies would be in the way. He sounds like a true leader here, thinking of the damage that can be done, willing to shoulder all of this alone. However, Reigen won't let that happen and instructs Dimple to follow closely behind in his stead, while Sho fights his father. I mean, I don't even think that's really the correct way to describe it, where, I mean, like, we're shown that he basically gets his face pushed in by his father. Anyway, aside from that, we're shown something I honestly wasn't expecting, but it truthfully made these final episodes all the more juicy thematically speaking. Serizawa versus Mob. Interestingly, this fight presented Mob with another less evil but still immeasurably destructive and harmful version of who he could have potentially been one day. A shut-in, isolated from society and far too anxious to ever engage with them properly. Due to this, he felt shunned by that very society and became easily led by the first silver-tongued manipulator willing to take a risk on him. One whose intentions were sinister, with one really sweet touch being at the very end of that engagement, when the counter soars to 100%, one that we've seen all too many times in this series, to drive home just how similar they are. The numbers don't represent Mob, but in fact, Serizawa's inner turmoil. With Mob choosing to absorb his attack and all the emotion that comes with it, gaining greater understanding and in turn send some of himself back to Serizawa so he too can understand that Mob truly understands it. This is beautiful, but once again, Mob manages to overcome an enemy without actually attacking them. And in that brief moment too, Mob demonstrates that he has the same abilities as Toichiro, to absorb others' powers. And we've seen it really with the Teru fight in season 1 too. He has this ability, he always has. So it's a really nice touch to see that this is something that they also have in common. But unlike Toichiro, another difference between them is that Mob doesn't really have any interest in abusing this ability. However, upon demonstrating this technique to Toichiro by lending energy to his beaten child, Toichiro launches into battle with Mob and acknowledges him as an enemy, kicking Dimple to Reigen below in the process, spurring him to act. There's a wonderfully classic and compelling set of back and forths between Reigen and Toichiro, very reminiscent of the climax of the very first season we all loved, with Reigen delivering perhaps the best comeback to Toichiro I think he could have ever said in that moment, saying, "If you ask me, you can only see powers that can't be seen, and so I feel sorry for you." That's just the right amount of bite mixed with compassion in there for it to be the perfect Reigen quip. However, as I'm sure many of you are already aware, this isn't the same scenario as Season 1's finale, and we are reminded quite quickly of that reality. Because of Mob's actions, because he spoke to and reached Serizawa not as a psychic weapon, but as a human being with aspirations, fears, and feelings, Serizawa, through Mob's gentle counsel, came to his senses quickly enough to come to Reigen's rescue at the last moment. What a wonderful scene, and what incredible character writing. Toichiro, as a result, starts to fire indiscriminately into the city, bellowing that he has no one he can trust. He's a total psychopath, and so it's time to rage. This is where the final battle of the series begins, and man, is it everything I hoped it would be and more. Mob creates an arena where he can go all out, and in doing so, with Toichiro forcing more and more power out of him, Mob starts to laugh, and for the first time in the series, it's unsettling. The sort of laugh one might get out of having lived in a world made of paper their entire lives, now finally able to cut loose without concern. He's just like Toichiro. He's becoming a monster just like him. It's come to my attention after finishing this spectacular season that there's a noticeable amount of criticism launched at this very fight scene, calling it underwhelming visually or emotionally even. And while I can in some ways put myself into the frame of mind of someone that would agree with that, I quite literally could not think of a more fitting villain and action sequence to play out before them than what we ended up being served here and now. Okay, well, that's almost true. I do have one hypothetically vague criticism question mark, but before I get there, I want to outline exactly why I loved this final stretch between the big bad and Mob. I love that this isn't a fight of good versus evil. It's a fight of hope versus the hopeless, optimism versus pessimism, altruism versus ego. I drew comparisons to what Mob's character offered mechanically in Season 1 that was similar to Gohan's character in Dragon Ball Z. And I'm glad I shared that comparison because while they do share that aspect of their character in common, the point of these characters and why they are the way that they are could not be more different. In Dragon Ball, there's a powerful sense of catharsis with Gohan's character, with he needing to learn to control his power and become responsible with it. However, during the series, mechanically, these rage boosts were moments of release for the audience to bask in and enjoy. This is decidedly not true with Mob. The point of Mob's story is specifically not to use his abilities unless absolutely necessary, and when he does lose himself to those darker tendencies that lurk within him, it's framed as a failing in his character, or a slip of judgment, or some horrible circumstance. At no point are we ever happy to see that happen to Mob. We might be excited in the moment, but narratively, it's seen as him losing rather than winning or embracing a side of himself. There's a scene where Mob genuinely cuts loose for a few moments and starts to sadistically laugh to himself. This is the moment I think a lot of folks were perhaps waiting for, but instead of embracing it, he felt let down by himself and reset. That, to me, is far more powerful than any rage moment that they could have conjured up in that scene, with him lamenting instead what he's forced to do. screaming to him, "You might not believe me, but I really do not want to hurt you." He even says sorry while throwing a city, skyscrapers and all, at Toichiro to stop him. And on the topic of Toichiro Suzuki, I just want to say I think his design is rather well thought through. All of the other members of Claw have very distinctive designs and quirks, designed specifically to be striking. Serizawa with his hair and umbrella, Minagishi with his hair and weirdness, Shibata and his roid rage, and even Shimazaki, who is the most normal looking but still has the quirk of his blindness. However, the boss of the entire organization is so very plain. The only identifying trait we are given are his eyebrows, and even then, those are probably only there really for the sake of clarity. Everything else about the design looks so mundane, measured, unremarkable. And to me, that only serves to reinforce further the similarities between him and Mob. Neither look too impressive and could easily be lost in a crowd. Visually, I love the story that this series is telling with his character and the elements they're choosing to share between him and Mob. But Toichiro, as a character, is far too powerful to be taken down so easily, so passively. He cannot be restrained, and that creates the natural issue and dilemma for Mob to try and solve. He has so far defeated his opponents with his words and outlook on life, but now he's met with what is or could have been effectively himself from an alternate reality, who is not focused on his own personal growth and development. Mob says, "I'm not strong enough. I don't have the power to show you a new path." And because he is so strong, because he is so lost in his vision of what reality is, Mob has to fight him. Oh, and what a fight. Man, in this moment, I fucking cried. Cried because he's doing exactly what brings him so much pain. Cried because he's desperately trying to prove that even if someone like Toichiro can be so far gone, he too can be saved. And I cried because those exact words are the mantra from some of the most supportive folks in his entire life. Friends that represent that part of Mob that's most valuable, the part that's human. Much like the climax of Season 1, this final fight here is not really about who is stronger. It is a battle of emotion, conviction, and worldviews. And the further into the fight we go, the more the music reflects that. While the beginning of the fight had plenty of rad fight music, by the end of it, though we are still watching the characters exchange legendary climactic blows, we are treated to more emotionally grounded music. With the final fight track, which is actually the theme labeled "Feelings Are the Source of Power," Mob vs. Toichiro is one of emotion and conviction rather than raw action and adrenaline. I think if I was to offer any tangible criticism towards this climax, it would be this, and really it's a nitpick at best. Like I said before, I wouldn't change any element of this encounter, but more so rearrange certain things that could perhaps create a more effective and cathartic conclusion. The way I see it, and I spoke with friends about this arc and season seem to have two monumental moments that ring to the core of the series as conclusions. And interestingly, they were placed far apart from each other, perhaps by design. Reigen's reconciliation and honesty with Mob in episode 7, and of course, the season's climax in episode 13. Both of these moments are spectacular, but for very different reasons, and to tell you the truth, I kind of see why they split them up. One is very much dependent on Reigen, and the other is very much the case with Mob more so. However, I do feel that if one somehow managed to combine these two moments in some meaningful way, it could have offered an emotional gut punch and cathartic bond the likes of which I've never seen before. But as it stands, 7 for me was the climax to the heart of the series, and episode 13 the climax to the inner conflict within Mob and the broader world. Both offer great experiences, and perhaps it works better this way, but normally writers tend to have the climax for their story occur at the end together to maximize the effect it has, and I'd be interested to see what that version of the series might look like if Reigen and Mob's reconciliation was saved for the climax of this fight. But, like I said, I think what they have here is an easy 9 out of 10, maybe even a 10 out of 10 if I don't want to be an asshole about it. Plus, it's not like I wasn't reduced to tears while watching this anyway. And with Toichiro saying things like, "I'm the protagonist of this world," and Mob saying, "I'm the protagonist of my own life," I think having philosophical outlooks duking it out without a more cluttered narrative in the background was probably a more fulfilling and focused idea in the end that one made. In the end, Mob stays with Toichiro, sits in his barrier with him, underneath all of his guards, and he won't let him suffer alone. Ready to shield the world from the blast that's brought about by the delusions of one madman, can Mob reach him before he meets an end molded by his own greed. In this moment, Mob, by absorbing his power, quite literally absorbs the trauma and pain from his life, showing in that moment the utility of the bonds that connect people to others. We share pain, We share the hurt we've experienced, and in this moment, Mob is trying to do everything he can to save Toichiro from himself. I can't think of a better way to end this, and this might sound like a tangent here, but The Last Airbender's final season, the climax to that entire series, I always had some issues with. But what Mob Psycho 100 has offered here is possibly the perfect way that series should have ended, and it instead does it itself here perfectly. There's nothing more that I can really say about this climax. I was just left speechless. It's perfect. And everything that unfolds after is just that. Perfect. Serizawa feeling like he has a new lease on life, now working for Reigen under the supervision and tutelage of Mob, with a close-up of his hands fidgeting to deal with anxiety being one of the sweetest things I've ever seen. God, I love this character, and I've only known him for like an episode and a half. This lost toy has found a home that will love him finally, with this final parting moment from the beautiful season leaving me teary-eyed once again. Anxiety aside, going into this more than anything, I was overcome with curiosity. How was one and this team working at Studio Bones going to make this final season feel final? There has to exist some emotional through line that gets paid off, so let's see what episode 1 has to offer. These seasons normally start off with a few standalone episodes that act as the building blocks or indicating factors that point us to the general direction of how this season is going to conclude. So let's see what's cooking in these first 2 episodes. Something I noticed rather quickly was the tonal difference or contrast expressed between these opening episodes from season 3 and the opening episodes from season 1. In those season 1 opening episodes, the focus of the plot was to demonstrate how and where Mob was lacking in his life, and that just so happened to be pretty much everywhere, with the first episode itself ending on a note that lingered with a sense of longing for what he doesn't have: friends. Season 3, on the other hand, opens with a collection of episodes emphasizing just how that has changed, forcing us to reflect on the evolution of this character, and the most powerful aspect of this being, he transformed in ways that all of us have the power to transform ourselves. As I pointed out in the beginning of this review series within the first episode itself, Mob felt very much like a side character in his own show, with him not really showing up until many scenes and character introductions later, acting as the mop for Reigen's mess, with his introduction to us in the very first episode being from behind where he was barely noticeable in the background of his own show, with the scene itself specifically centered around him as he's surrounded by all of his friends he's made thanks to the brave choices he's stuck to. I love stuff like this, and the substance of the episode itself only further reflects why I love it. Career Path Survey. God, I remember those, and good God almighty, I did not know what to do. Ranked 190th, which is very middle of the road for that school apparently, Mob sits nicely, and doesn't really know what he wants to do, but all he does know is that he wants to pursue his crush. We get exposed to pretty much every other adjacent character's overall academic ranking. The Body Improvement Club all looks like how you'd expect. They've put all of their time into their bodies, and their academic goals are either nothing or are helped by the extracurricular achievements in sports and athletics. Except for one. I love how one of them is randomly ranked second in the entire school or year, I'm not sure, and looking to become a vet. That's just kind of funny. But all that aside, I do relate to this episode quite a lot. I remember distinctly at the age of 17 sitting in my guidance counselor's office completely stressed out of my mind when she confronted me about not filling in my forms for college yet. Truth is, at 17 and well, even at 25, I still didn't know what it was that I wanted to do with my life. This is all to say that not knowing what to put down for one of these future forms in school is stressful and at worst depressing and terrifying. As I praised at the end of episode 13 of season 2, I was thrilled that Serizawa and Mob both found a place in Reigen's business that helped them feel like something worthwhile. And the way this episode builds and leans into this new dynamic was brilliant. They encounter a man professing that he has been cursed by a spirit that has made his life unsuccessful. He attributes all of his personal, social, and professional failings to this spirit. And while Mob and Serizawa exercise this spirit successfully, both are left reeling after this encounter as they can both see themselves in the mistakes this man has made. This man is in his 50s, Serizawa is 30, and Mob is still in school, but looking at this man offers them a mirror or future projection to how their lives might be if they don't make the right decisions from here on in. And this is where Mob demonstrates profound levels of growth as a character once again, and really this aspect of his character is where the focus focus is placed in these opening episodes. While the first few episodes of season 1 demonstrated fairly basic areas of Mob's life where he was severely lacking, these episodes offer far more understandably complicated and difficult social situations and professional circumstances where many people might find difficulty, but Mob somehow finds a way out of it thanks to his mindset, the most interesting of which episode 1 concludes with. And this conclusion Mob reaches concerns comfort, and one's choices dictated by that. The idea that comfort isn't necessarily a goal one should seek, but rather the enemy of personal development and progress is a wonderfully mature and profound way of looking at things for someone as young as he is. And because of this, Mob has to make decisions he otherwise isn't comfortable with because they are what's best for him. That he must eventually step away from Reigen and his company, with his reason being the only thing that would change about him if he were to stay there would be his age. And the best part is, there's no hard feelings, and Reigen supports Mob's decision.
とにかくやりたいことなんて別に仕事じゃなくたっていいし、お前はお前の好きなように生きればいいんだ。
Somewhat confusingly, the episode ends with Dimple sitting atop a giant piece of broccoli that was in the arc prior. This doesn't make any sense in context, but we'll no doubt in a few episodes or so. Episode 2, in the same fashion as episode 1, acts as a standalone episode that serves to emphasize the growth of Mob again. More specifically, his ability to speak up for himself, his ability to lead and prioritize problems that he has despite it being inconvenient to others. He's able to put himself first, which is great for everyone to learn. The episode itself sees Mob accept the job of a costume or prop designer for a school day of sorts, all the while Reigen humors the silly antics of some self-professed yokai hunter? Okay. Naturally, this doesn't interest Reigen until a massive amount of money becomes involved, to which Reigen begins speaking in a theatrical fashion just like the yokai hunter. It's hilarious and fun, specifically when the yokais eventually do show up. However, there is one thing that's a little weird about this place. There's like these weird roots and vines growing everywhere. I don't know, whatever, I'm sure it's nothing. They take out the Yokai King easily, and in the process of doing so, Mob solved his own problems without the help of Reigen, which is again another wonderful little development. In the end, the work Mob and his team did for his school wasn't exactly praised, but it felt rewarding because they liked it and they knew they had worked hard to make it. Now, before I dive into the minutiae of the next 4 episodes, which make for themselves a very compelling and well thought out mini-arc, I'd like to discuss a rather large change that's taken place on the production side of things for this season 3 specifically. During my breakdown of the production for the prior 2 seasons of the series, Tachikawa was the series director in addition to being super hands-on throughout those seasons. Unfortunately, during the production of this final season, he was busy directing an anime called Blue Giant, and so a new series director was brought in called Takehiro Hasui. Hasui's been with Studio Bones since 2012 and directed the 6th episode of Mob Psycho in Season 2, so he's not a complete outsider by any means, but this is the first time he's ever led a TV series. Interestingly, however, while Tachikawa was working on another project, he did remain somewhat working on the series in a more hands-off supervisory role. Though, outside of offering a small bit of storyboarding in episode 10, his main contribution was taking on a scripting role, writing episodes 7 and 8 of this final season, which isn't too strange seeing as he also wrote episodes 6 and 7 in season 2. Now, I thought this was worth mentioning right off the bat because it's not often you see directors of adapted works writing scripts. Moving on from those broad strokes, however, the first episode is both boarded and directed by Hasui himself, so it's nice to get a sense right away of how suitable he is for this role. The answer is very. Mob Psycho 100 is such a special series to these people because it's all about elevating its source material, taking fun ideas from one's manga and extrapolating cool new set pieces from them. Right in the first half of this episode, Reigen fixing something with rice is turned into an hilariously dramatic action move in the anime. It's a simple change, but one that lets me breathe a sigh of relief over the demonstration that this still feels very much like Mob through and through. Within the first episode also, we have returning character animator Toshiyuki Sato animating a very Kameda-esque sequence of Reigen along with Koki Fujimoto of Chainsaw Man fame, who produced this fantastic scene that feels like a nice parallel to a similar season 1 sequence. And it's certainly not the only reference in this episode either. Concerning episode 2, however, Hasui storyboards once again, and we get to see his skills as an action storyboarder this time around, and I was very curious to see the results of this. And these results are pretty damn competent, tying together characters and the environment in ways we've come to expect from this series. You can see this throughout in these stunning stunning sequences that showcase awesome background animation, which, as I mentioned during my breakdowns of previous seasons, is but one of the many common elements of Mob's animation in its series that does not make use of CGI. Overall, the second episode for me was one that definitely solidifies Hasui as a great successor to Tachikawa. However, as I'm sure you'll notice as I talk about what else this season has to offer, what's probably the most fascinating aspect about this season is that it completely breaks the mold of a typical anime production. As I mentioned in the previous videos, Mob Psycho's production always had a strong production environment, often finishing its production before the final episode airs, but Season 3 was different. This time, the entire season was completed before even the first episode hit the air. This is almost unheard of. Now, with that said, however, this season isn't as action-driven as the prior two, nor is it quite as ambitious due to many of its former animator associates being busy elsewhere, but a conservative season by Mob Psycho 100 standards is still light years ahead of most other shows, and despite this talent pool change, there are plenty of returning stars to continue to shine. Mio Sato returns once again with her incredible paint-on-glass animation throughout the season, and she even takes on the ending sequence herself, something she also wowed us with back in Season 1. I have so much more to say about this production, but I'll leave it here for now. Time to move on to the next and first mini-arc of this final season. The Divine Tree. Right off the bat, I just want to say that this mini-arc is my favorite part of Mob Psycho thus far. I liked it better than the climax to both the previous arcs, and I shall intend on explaining why in this preceding section, but in short, it's a rather straightforward story with nuances and interesting areas for the involved characters, taking them in directions we've not yet seen before in this series to date, all told within the context of broccoli zombies. You heard me right, broccoli zombies. This is the best arc of all time.
たまには遊ぼうよ。
There's a really cute but short scene that kicks off this episode, and indeed this mini-arc to a large extent, where Mob actually has a positive interaction with Tsubomi without embarrassing himself and indeed impressing Tsubomi by coming to her social rescue. The point of this successful interaction once again is to act as a contrast to the horrible interactions he's had in the past, all the while shining a light on the blossoming social life he now has with a number of girls in his school, with that reality suddenly paving the way for a very different set of circumstances to befall Mob, that being, he's popular. How can you blame him? But the tearful pride, relief, and happiness Ritsu has for his older brother speaks for itself. He knows how he struggles socially, and to see that no longer be the case must be a massively uplifting sight for him. It's such a wonderfully tender moment, but it isn't without certain drawbacks. Hilariously on-the-nose visual metaphors aside, Mob does get a big head over this concerning his newfound popularity. And this could not come at a worse time because it's also the time the cult surrounding Mob has mobilized around the giant broccoli to worship it. And moments later, Dimple shows up and says to Mob, his popularity has gone to his head, and confronts him about the founder of the new religion audition, and Dimple, true to fashion, tries to weasel his way into the conversation, but Mob sees through it, and maybe his ego allows him to believe he doesn't need Dimple's help at all. Mob's confidence is turning into overconfidence, and that's when Mob confronts Dimple with a pointed question.
横取りしようとしてるのはエクボも同じでしょ。他の連中っていう人たちと何が違うの？もう悪巧みやめたら。
Two failed arranged meetings with Mob and female friends later, and one bad t-shirt purchase, we find that despite Mob having decided to go onto the podium to audition for the position of founder, since Misato bailed on him, Mob didn't go. But curiously, someone looking just like Mob arrives at the podium to wow the audience. This is where the plot of this mini-arc starts to ramp up and things really start to become mysterious. As Reigen watches from the comfort of his own home on livestream, this supposed founder sprouting before everyone in the audience a giant broccoli stalk. The next day yields a lot of suspicious activity. Both Misato and Tomo, who they were both meant to meet Mob the day prior, now are suddenly all in with this new religion, but in addition to that, have no memory of why they bailed on the respective arranged meetings with Mob in the first place. But once Reigen shows Mob the clip online, mixed with the strange goings-on in the town, being slowly infested with these mysterious roots, not to mention those weird new broccoli green candies people are giving out for free everywhere, the true nature of what's actually happening starts to form a clearer image. They need to destroy that broccoli, and Mob agrees. In the midst of all this craziness, Teru has his own little adventure with the brainwashing broccoli plant. The section itself is really well directed, and there's a heavy emphasis on the smaller details in the day-to-day that I really enjoyed. The openings of fridges, the slow rise of someone's head to look up, or even the use of a mundane vending machine. All these subtle details that are given extra attention really help to ground the episode, no pun intended, but more broadly, this section really, more than anything else, just serves to expose us to the real enemy of this section and what we can come to expect from him and his goals. Vomiting up the food that he had just been brainwashed with, Teru investigates the giant plant in an effort to put an end to all of this craziness, but through doing so, gets sucked into a terrifying fight against this broccoli mob figure. The fight between the two is rather great, but once again, this section really serves primarily to expose us to the necessary details of this character that we're encountering right now, to show us what this being's strengths and powers truly are, while cutting away to other characters like Minagishi, who grabs the roots draining the city and falls to the floor unconscious as a result. And as the fight continues with Teru, it's finally revealed that all of this has been Dimple all along. Dimple is the founder, the spirit who formulated all of this. He says that Mob doesn't matter, that he's always had one goal, and that will be to become a modern god. Ooh, the plot suddenly just became so much more interesting. A foundational character now playing a key role in an adversarial position. And cut away to Mob and Reigen formulating a plan. They think that they might need help with this, and so see if Ritsu will help. When in actuality, he's actually brainwashed and just guides them to more followers in the hopes that they accept this new religion too. Needless to say, Mob and Reigen just run away. And as of right now, it's really starting to feel like the entire city is pursuing them, like there's no one left in their right mind. And feeding into this very notion is a brilliant piece of character writing between Mob and Reigen when Reigen catches Mob calling the founder fake. Now, this is a very important thing for him to call him out on. Reigen says that that's a very strange thing to say, seeing as the group didn't have a founder in the first place. And this is so subtle, and while it does go on to be revealed that Reigen is also brainwashed by the wacky plan too, it's also evident that something far more subtle is at the root of all of this. Mob's ego. The same ego that pushed Dimple away to perform this mess, but needless to say, Mob doesn't accept anything Reigen says, of course, and tearfully runs away to set this whole situation straight. With heroic music booming in the background, he begins to step towards the divine tree. He's going to save everyone, and visually, this is communicated by him stepping out of the shadows, no longer hiding, and asking for free entry to the person who so feverishly in the past begged him to do just that. People rejoice that they now have two founders. Tsubomi and all the gym bros watch on. This tree and Dimple have infected the minds of the entire city. This is where things really start to get mindfucky, and this fanfare Mob is experiencing, this clapping and cheering, it's all from Dimple. And strangely, it contrasts harshly against what he said the episode prior, that he doesn't need Mob anymore. Well, if he's trying to feed into Mob's ego here to manipulate him, why is he doing so if he doesn't need him? He shows him Teru restrained and claims that Ritsu and Reigen are under his influence too, with the explosion counter in Mob rising. He even draws attention to what he made Reigen say, that in the end, the ones who have the most fun win.
それをレーゲン師匠に言わせたのもお前だったのかエクボ。
Dimple tries to convince Mob to join him, explaining that everyone in the city and everyone he ever knew is under his control now. I think it's safe to say that Dimple within this series is one of the few characters who can claim that they know who Mob really is and how he thinks, what his weaknesses are, and what he can do to exploit just that. And he does so through uncertainty. And it's quite unsettling. He forces Teru to fight Mob, trying to confuse Mob by leveraging the lesson he tried to tell Teru back in Season 1, not to use his powers for his own self-interest, and all of this makes even me as an audience member feel unsure and unsettled as a result, but Mob, he sticks to his convictions, because he isn't the same kid that was in Season 1. Exploding with power, sending Teru flying, more of these broccoli monsters start to show up and subdue Mob as his explosion meter rises. Dimple, still refusing to show himself despite being called upon by Mob, refusing to face him. Is he scared? Well, Mob falls to the floor after clutching his chest. His powers being sucked away. Dimple is now all-powerful, deciding at this moment now to appear before Mob. But interestingly, despite fighting him, the vast majority of his time is spent still trying to convince him over to his way of thinking.
これがこの度めでたく進呈した神エクボ様だ。
Just a quick aside for a second, the animation for this transformation, and indeed this form, reminds me so much of Frieza's transformation into Golden Frieza. Everything from the form itself to even the reveal animation. The swooping grand angles feel very Frieza, but also really help to sell what Dimple is doing here. Dimple is combining everything he knows about Mob to defeat him, draining him of the max energy he demonstrated during the fight against Toichiro Suzuki, alongside the mind games he learned from Mogami, through the lens of someone Mob thought of as a friend no less. This is an interestingly evil decision by Dimple, and an approach that me sitting right here now watching has me thinking, damn, this just might actually work. On both of these occasions, Mob came close to losing, to dying, and combining these approaches with a close friend's underhanded attack, it's more likely to succeed than pretty much any other approach that's been taken in the series. However, in response to this, Mob takes a different approach again.
見合わない、許さない、認めない。
Dimple explodes with a massive attack and regrets firing it with such energy almost immediately by catching himself, but he says that he can still feel his rage. Mob once more asks for Dimple to say something honest, something authentic, but he doesn't and attacks one last time.
シャツが出せ!
I think given the fact that Mob has been the point of view character in this mini arc, with him effectively trying to figure out the mystery surrounding Dimple with his ever dwindling number of allies, it's then an interesting choice to not have Mob himself be the POV character of the climax, but instead to switch it over to Dimple once he reveals himself. We're shown his internal thoughts, his strategies, and his concern as Mob creeps closer and closer to 100%, and once he does explode, nothing happens, because we're still stuck only seeing the thoughts of Dimple. We're made to empathize with him that little bit more. We're confused just like him. What is happening? And the monologue from Dimple is quite telling. He's confused, but not once prattles on about his plans for world domination. He's not looking past Mob even in the slightest. In fact, he seems more concerned about whether or not he, Mob, has given up on him, that he's resigned to giving up, to turning this fight into a half-assed climax. And I think that, more than anything else in this arc, feels like a cry for help. Like he wants Mob to convince him. And as Dimple threatens Mob's life one last time with a sharp blade inches from his face, Mob says he won't do it. By turning off his powers, Mob lays himself defenseless, and by doing so, exposes Dimple in return, both metaphorically and literally pushing through his guard.
やっぱりエクボは信頼できる。
The lesson here harkens back to a number of instances in this story, reflected in the words Reigen offered him in passing about those who gain confidence usually going too far before finding their footing later. And as Mob admits, rightfully, he didn't treat Dimple with the level of respect and care he needed to when he was at his most vulnerable. Through this, Mob realizes the role he played, all the while seeing that the exact same shortcoming and lesson befell Dimple. They were two people going through the same thing, and by being such, fed into one another, creating this mess we see before us. By hearing him out and offering him what he's always truly needed, Dimple is allowed to, on his own terms, realize for himself that he has more in common with Mob than he might have ever even realized. That just like him, all he has ever really wanted wasn't to be a god or to be a leader or to be some cult of personality, but to be acknowledged, to be seen, to have a real friend that wants him for who he is and nothing more. And it makes sense that manipulation is Dimple's calling card in this instance. He doesn't trust anyone to actually want to altruistically be his friend. And in giving Dimple that time of day, Mob saved everyone in the town and indeed Dimple from himself. It's a brilliant story, reaching a conclusion with Dimple carrying a defenseless and sleeping Mob back to his bed to rest.
目的も失ったし、どうすっかな。
And suddenly,
おい。
This is such a cool idea, made possible with this world and its unique mechanics, but what in reality is happening here is that Dimple now has to face the consequences of his actions alone, without the help of his support system, to do what makes him uncomfortable, to do something dangerous for someone else, to do the right thing. The Psycho Helmet wants Mob for sustenance, but Dimple refuses his advances. Here we have a fight between the real Dimple and the part of him that he rejected, his good side versus his evil tendencies, and I was so excited watching this. The way this broccoli doppelganger moves is even spooky in and of itself. Like he's some sort of evil spirit or specter, impervious to the attacks of the real world. And in this moment, Dimple is the only one standing in defense of an unconscious mob while staring down hundreds of clones. The fight itself is spectacular and comes with its own bells and whistles we've come to expect from this incredible series, with Dimple slowly having the energy drained by his impressive foe. But even outside of that, there's such an incredible sense of scale to this fight. The occasion is grand and the action surrounding it, my god, it's stunning. And then, the final scene takes place, where from the midst of this intense action, we cut to Dimple waking up Mob. He's unable to stand, but for the first time proper, Dimple is able to use his powers to manipulate Mob for his own good. And despite the goals he's espoused to have in the past, he chooses to let Mob walk out under his own power. It's through this brief interaction that Dimple acknowledges just how strong Mob is, and as the seconds tick by, we notice a scratch on his cheek and more damage as time passes on. And as the camera pans out slowly but surely, we recognize the damage that Dimple himself has taken, and moreover, that he's used this power to lure Mob home because he knows he may never see him ever again. From such a heartfelt and uplifting finish to their encounter, one has dragged us back to the pits of despair and sorrow as he reminds us of what happens when we get too carried away, when we hurt too many people, that those consequences just might exact the ultimate toll. It's a crushingly beautiful, selfless, heroic, and sad scene, but one I am delighted Dimple got to have. And as Mob sits there, lying in his bed, unsure of what exactly happened, his heart knows the truth, and he cries himself to sleep. This is the first major action episode of the season and was directed by Yuta Kiso. Having previously worked as an animator on shows like My Hero Academia as a regular animator, episode 6 is his very first time directing an episode proper, and interestingly, he's actually a newcomer to Mob Psycho 100 series, having only contributed a small, rather unrecognizable section of season 2's opening. Transitioning from an animator to a director/storyboard artist can be rough, but his work here is truly remarkable. Not only does it nail the action sequences with the most monumental scale possible, it also manages to execute the emotional moments with real gravitas. The animation staff assembled for this episode is pure all-star material also, and the results speak for themselves. I mean, this does not stop moving. Yoshimichi Kameda takes on the animation director role, and along with him there's the legendary Yutaka Nakamura, Yuki Hayashi, Hironori Tanaka, and many other all-star names. It really is just the most ludicrous episode. Nakamura's sequence is undeniably the highlight, however, of the episode, with his trademark three-dimensionality and dynamic lighting that just explodes off the screen. The scale here, I have to reiterate, is off the charts. Tanaka's smoke is also insane, and the snappy timing feels very Kameda-esque in its execution, helping these sequences blend together nicely. Many people know Yuki Hayashi for his Dragon Ball Super Broly work and his many contributions to My Hero Academia, and he's here too, pulling off the same craziness with arguably the most weighty scene in the episode. There's a quality to this work that's hard to put into words. It never loses its sense of exaggeration, despite how much grounded oomph it conveys. The big emotional finale with wonderful lip sync, however, hasn't had its animator identified yet, but it's one of those scenes that jumps into realism in a way that really grabs your eyes and emphasizes the emotional weight of the scene. The Telepathy Club arc. These are the episodes that convinced me that this story could focus on just about any of the supporting cast and still deliver superb storytelling that captures my attention and imagination perfectly. I love these characters, and on this particular occasion, it's graduation time. Entrance exams for some private schools will start soon, and unlike the last mini-arc, which focused largely on Mob himself, this one more specifically focuses on the insecurities of Tomei and the wider Telepathy Club as they struggle to face a difficult reality, that they may just have wasted all their times goofing off instead of working on themselves or building memories in this club, taking it seriously. This is a very interesting idea and direction to build on the story. We've seen Mob focus on the Body Improvement Club for these very reasons, and in this moment we see the rest of the club sort of come to grips with that lesson, with the very growing pains of this realization acting as the impetus for this entire mini-arc.
脳幹電波部はこれにて解散。まあまあ楽しかったわ。
This is the indirect call to action for the rest of the club to try and help Tomei not feel as though she's a total failure, to help her once and for all make real strides towards her goal that she created this club for, to meet aliens. Now, naturally, something like that would seem completely unreasonable in any other sort of story, but let's not forget that this is Mob Psycho 100's world. We're talking about a story where the main character can hurl buildings while crying and a magical giant head of broccoli can brainwash thousands. And so naturally, Inukawa, one of the other boys from the Telepathy Club, employs the help of Mob, who employs the help of Ritsu, who eventually employs the help of those two,
Yeah, come on, you can do it. I believe in you.
what were their names?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, the twins, Daichi and Kaito. Who could forget them? Anyway, jokes aside, while the stakes are comparatively low compared to those that occupied much of Season 2, the fact that this contends more personally with the characters we've all come to know and have grown attached to, it actually feels all the more important as a result of that. I was so damn invested in how they were going to resolve some of these seemingly unsolvable problems. How would they attract the attention of a real telepath and not a crappy one like these guys? Well, as it happens, they can send a signal to attract other telepaths, and Mob can boost that signal, which creates one of the coolest twists and creative choices of the entire season.
誰だ？うわ、びっくりした。お前らなんでここにいんの？
Takanaka, the guy who left the club in episode 2 of season friggin' 1, answers the call. I cannot describe to you how damn cool this choice was creatively. Not only is it a callback that sent me reeling, but his showing up and initial departure are all linked to the underlying themes and journey of this story. The reason he left in the first place was because they clearly weren't serious like he was about understanding telepathy and the club itself. But as soon as they start to show that level of seriousness and compassion, they created for themselves the perfect set of circumstances to bring him specifically back into the fold. This is terrific storytelling and character writing 101, and even some advanced shit. It is awesome. And the icing of the cake is Mob breaks through his wall too, finding common ground with him coming from a place of isolation also. And guess what? Takanaka, because he's a telepath, knows that Mob isn't lying to him. I love stuff like that, and this was by far the best scene of the episode.
すいません師匠、遅くなりました。
気にするな。今日は大晦日だし、ゆっくり行こうぜ。
This scene is hilarious, and if you know, you know. I ain't explaining why. The plan, however, is to drive to a mountain, go to the top of it, and give Toma her telepathy experience, with Reigen agreeing to tag along and drive, with the ultimate goal being to use Takanaka to make contact with aliens using Mob as a signal booster. As they make their way up the mountain, enjoying setbacks both mentally and geographically, I just have to point out that the direction of this episode is absurdly stunning and on another level compared to pretty much every other episode I've seen up until now. And you best believe I'll be talking about exactly this in the production section for this episode in just a moment, but regarding the narrative, there's a moment with Takanaka that once again highlights that one knows exactly where to put the focus in his stories, and that place is the heart and emotion of a particular scene. And really, more than anything else, that's the calling card of this particular artist. It's why, despite the crude drawings at times, millions of people read his work. More than just this incredible direction I praised earlier, it's the heartfelt and tender message that this episode offers. Takanaka cared so much about this and Toma's experience that he dedicated his entire night to learning and researching everything he needed to for today, explaining away his lateness earlier in the episode, which was a brilliant touch. It's just such a touching revelation, with the very ritual that takes place itself acting as a wonderful prelude for all of us to take a lesson from. That venturing outside of our comfort zone and putting in effort with friends to achieve and try something is not only fun, but can change our lives, create memories, and more importantly, can change your outlook on life. However, shockingly, they do make contact with aliens. I love how Tome is so nervous that she reaches out to shake their hand with the wrong hand to do so with. It's such a subtle detail, but for me really went a long way in visually communicating how nervous and really important this moment was for her. Needless to say, they have a great time hanging out with the aliens and playing games like they did in their homeroom. Almost like all that time wasn't wasted after all. And yet, despite all that's going on, Reigen's mind is on the passage of time. The new year, late fees on his rental. He looks at this group of kids and says that they are, quote, blinding, almost like their future is all ahead of them and looks promising. And I'm of course just inferring this, but when you take into account his relationship with his mom, what she's been writing to him, and what little he's shared about his past, it all seems to point in the direction, perhaps also alluding to him not feeling fulfilled in his life. I mean, he's very much the proverbial extra wheel in this group of children, while having himself no plans for New Year's. Anyway, with that said, they all exchange gifts with the aliens before leaving, except Inukawa, who accidentally stays and gets abducted. More on that in just a second. Tomei is thrilled with her experience and says it's a new year she will never forget. This was a really nice, serious, oddly introspective, and emotionally mature mini-arc centered around a group that represented exactly the opposite of that in the series. And really, that's perfect, because this episode is for people that feel like that. The end of school life as we know it is a formative period for anyone, and to see this story leverage that common aspect of all of our lives to help tell this captivating and heartwarming tale is just so powerful. Production. The one, the only, Hakuyo Go returns to completely blow minds once again, in a distinct flavor unlike anything we've yet seen from him, and it is breathtaking. Go's head-turning episodes have previously been huge action climaxes, and yet this is an episode with no such fighting or action, and one that proves, more importantly, that Go's versatility knows no limits as an artist. And I'm referring to him as an artist and not simply as an animator here, because, much like his episode on Season 2, this is all from a single mind. He takes on the role of direction, storyboarding, and animation direction, meaning everything you see in this episode is Go through and through. His animation direction here is incredibly striking, doing away with model sheet adherence in favor of blobby, loose characters with almost no shading and very distinctive rounded hair, displaying a constant striking approach that extends throughout the episode entirely and is truly emblematic of how Mob's production environment is creator first. Its artistic freedom has been a defining part of its success, and it really is on full display here. It truly cannot be overstated also, however, just how animated this episode is and feels. When talking about other episodes, I've definitely said, this does not stop moving, which is a bit of hyperbole to emphasize the insanity that is the quality of the animation across the episodes. But that statement applies with no hyperbole whatsoever right here. It genuinely does not stop with its ludicrous character animation for its entire runtime. It is one of the most insane feats I've ever seen committed to an episode of its type, and the painful thing is, I'm sure a lot of people typically wouldn't notice this because it isn't an action episode. There's such a grounded approach to the animation that, believe it or not, it is not rotoscoped in any way also. You have foreign animators like Julian Bentley producing insane work of characters simply walking. There's crazily detailed shots that have no reason to be as good as they are, such as Reigen taking his shirt off. Like, that is insane, and it's a background element. It just goes on and on. Walk cycles from super hard angles, fully fleshed out cities and crowd shots. It is breathtaking through and through. And on the topic of talking about crazy animation Sakuga, this episode also has what is as close as you can get to music Sakuga, if that makes any sense at all. Starting at 1646, the entire back third of the episode is one contiguous, dedicated piece of music. Not something that you see literally anywhere else in general, let alone Kawaii's Mob Psycho 100 score. And honestly, this creative choice has me perplexed. Maybe one could argue that it gives this entire section of the episode a rather alien feel to it. Not that it sounds alien, but that it feels alien to have this one big piece of music over an entire third of an episode unbroken. I mean, that big track does transition from largely earthly textures like strings and woodwinds to more alien-sounding instruments like synth patches once we do get to the final scene detailing Inukawa's adventures in outer space. And then, as if the episode itself wasn't enough of a flex, it throws in a crazy alien jungle sequence animated to perfection by Yuki Hayashi once again and Ajin. And on the topic of this closing section, it reminds me, Tachikawa scripted this episode and features some major changes to the manga. In manga, many chapters famously end with omake stories that are not present in the anime generally speaking. But interestingly, in the manga, some of these actually expand on character backgrounds that are not present in the anime, like the Awoken Kids, for example, which got that added bit of attention in the manga. But for these particular omakes, at the end of the Telepathy Club story, Tachikawa used them to produce the strangest and yet greatest sequence in the series, Inukawa's abduction. The manga section of this plays out as a regular gag manga, ending abruptly at the moment where they come back to Earth and realize that they can't find Inukawa. That's the punchline, that's the joke, that's the end of it. Then, during the next few chapters of the mob conclusion story, we're presented with the omake known as Inukawa's diary, every chapter representing a different time and experience from those abduction days, narrated by Inukawa himself via a journal he's writing, and it's the same journal we saw in the anime. But the anime, on the other hand, takes all those omake pages and makes this weird, crazy, somewhat unsettling and hilarious story about Inukawa's misadventures in this alien world. It's an outstanding change to the source material in my book, and one that totally enhances the material. The final arc, episodes 9, 10, 11, and 12.
Say the line!
Mark. This is the best arc of Mob Psycho 100 by default. And I say as much because it utilizes literally every element and every event that made the Mob Psycho 100 story what it is today. This is a storytelling triumph, and more than that, an utter masterpiece, masterstroke, and masterful work of art. As everything from the production to the narrative setup and set pieces and even the music work together with a unified vision of bringing to life what is, in my estimation, one of, if not the best arc of storytelling I've seen from an anime in my life. This is a special story, one near and dear to my heart now, and I hope that while I break down why I think this is so impressive, you find something that you too can take away from it. So let's dive in. One of the many aspects that makes this arc so successful in my opinion is how it leverages a character's point of view to tell a compelling story. Changing the point of view of whose or narrative POV can be interesting, but changing POVs can also give us a clearer picture of the reality at hand, divorced from the feelings of a particular onlooker. Now that's a lot of words. What do I mean? Well, for now, let's take a look at the focus of this episode and indeed a big role player in this final arc, Tsubomi. This arc is effectively about Mob mustering the courage to ask out Tsubomi before she transfers to a different school. And in the opening moments of this arc, we see a dream Mob is having about her and him playing as children. It's nice, it's warm, and it's fantastical. However, when we contrast that with the actual core memories he has of her while he's awake, you have for yourself a very different outlook on the scene and indeed her as a person, creating this sense that while she and he were once close, nowadays that doesn't seem to be the case. This is reinforced musically around the 9-minute mark of episode 9, where we hear the music that was used for the alien investigation now repurposed for the discussion between Mob and Misato concerning Tsubomi, someone who is now foreign to both of these folks talking in the scene. But what's more is that in this scene, and indeed later episodes again, they begin to show a very understated visual design aspect of Tsubomi that I could well imagine went unnoticed by many people watching this video. And it's unique to the anime. In the manga, Tsubomi is depicted with largely the same style all the other girls have. Plain, mostly regular sized eyes, crude eyelashes, etc. But in the anime, she is the only female character with traditionally anime characteristics. Huge sparkly anime eyes, more traditional anime eye shapes, thick top eyelashes, you know the stuff. However, in this episode, around the 9-minute mark again, a keen eye begins to notice that how Tsubomi looks in the anime is probably actually largely up to Mob's interpretation or fantasy of her through his point of view. And so, when we see Tsubomi from Misato's point of view in this scene, 9 minutes into the 9th episode, we see her depicted less flatteringly, with the bottom eyelashes and smaller, more traditional eyes. Later in the finale too, we see this even more explicitly in this sequence of images. This little detail, which is also a bit of a retroactive explanation for her played up anime design, is brilliant in my opinion. And on the narrative front, the entire episode itself is basically comprised of Mob asking the advice of the litany of characters that have made up this series for advice on how he can approach asking Tsubomi out. And honestly, Reigen's advice is the best piece he receives, saying that while he should keep all the advice he's received in mind, he shouldn't worry about strategy or keeping up appearances. That if Tsubomi is the sort of girl Mob wants a deep relationship with, she'll like him and be with him for who he is. And interestingly, once Mob leaves, he shares a rather illuminating piece of dialogue concerning his view of himself. He says, "If this were me, I'd probably just try to be slick. I mean, if they found out who I really was, I'd get rejected in an instant. This was a line that confirmed for me that my suspicions concerning Reigen's self-esteem were well-founded. Near the end of this episode, Mob decides to set up a meeting with Tsubomi via a phone call, and I cannot imagine I was the only one with their heart in their stomach while watching this, hoping and praying that he doesn't mess up too badly. And I think this is emphasized because for the entire call there's virtually no music, just ambient noise from Mob's house. There's an unusually heavy emphasis on folly here. Sounds of doors opening, bags rustling, footsteps are all elevated higher in the mix than they would usually be. A great call in my opinion, as it really heightens the tension of the scene. I think many of us have been there on phone calls with significant others or crushes when we were younger. The feeling is not unfamiliar. The silence of almost everything but the words and the sounds around them capture this sense of tension we all know too well. Which brings us to the fateful day where Mob makes his way to the park to meet Tsubomi and ask her out. Everyone he's met and continues to meet seems to make this process the best it can be. All the advice, support, and even flowers he's given are all provided by people that he has helped in the past. Surely this encounter will be the same. This is the part of the story where we realize that Mob has one more demon to exercise. One more emotional hurdle to overcome, and when I say that this is one of the best depictions of struggling to accept who you are as a person, I mean that. What unfolds from this point on is utterly and dumbfoundingly incredible on a narrative, animation, and even a musical level. No punches are pulled here, and just like the rest of the series, the entire crew and production behind this entire series is firing on all cylinders. This is the final time we are introduced to the character indicated by 3 question marks. Mob has overcome a host of difficult adversaries across this series, some stronger than others and many which pushed him in complicated existential and sometimes physical methods, the likes of which he only barely made it out of those situations alive. Characters like the members of Claw, Mogami, Toichiro to name only but a few, but today Mob faces the individual he's been the most fearful of throughout this series. The foe that is the indirect source of Mob's internal traumas and indeed the main antagonist of this entire series, himself. And who can stop him? As an adaptation, the reference of question mark after Mob gets hit by a car is handled quite differently in the manga than it is in the anime. Once again, it becomes a question of direction and point of view here, in other words, what we as an audience member are allowed to see and understand. The biggest difference the manga offers here is that we actually get to see much more of Mob than we do in the anime. In the anime, there's no dialogue for him, and instead we don't see him standing up and destroying everything that gets in his way. Instead, we see the destruction wrought on the city from far away, through the eyes of civilians, the news, and other characters from the show. Personally, I really like this approach as it offers this sense that someone else is behind the wheel, someone we don't know. And by keeping this distance, the directors indirectly position us as viewers to see this as the act of a mindless monster, causing destruction around him out of pure instinct. In other words, we get the distinct impression that this isn't the Kageyama Shigeo that we all know and love. The manga, however, takes a very different approach, and honestly, there's merit to this direction too. There's this ominous feeling from him when he wakes up. He talks for the very first time, and what he says tells us right away that this is in fact not Kageyama Shigeo. This is the moment of confirmation, and in the anime, this is presented much later during an inner monologue between the two of them. When you already know the identity of the power, that he is part of our Mob, a part that he kept hidden from everybody, you realize that Shigeo and Mob might as well be 2 separate identities at odds in his mind. And this was when you might think that those 3 question mark symbols on his percentage name could instead represent 3 missing letters. M-O-B. Personally, I prefer the approach taken in the anime. It positions us as fans to receive the swerve later on in a much more effective fashion, in my opinion, and moreover feeds into this narrative direction the story will be taking from this point on. That Mob is in trouble, and whoever this is needs to be stopped. I think from a structural standpoint, the most impressive aspect narratively, or one of them at least, is that of who is chosen to stand in the way of the rogue Mob and why. And to those that didn't catch it, this might be a pretty neat little observation I've made. As I mentioned, for the longest time, Mob has been terrified of this exact situation occurring. A traumatic concern born from a lifetime of feeling like he has no control past a certain point. A breaking point we've been shown a number of times throughout this story. What instances during this story did he break? Who did he break in front of? Teru, Koyama, Toichiro, Ritsu. all of the people who, in that order, stand in his way one after the other in this very arc. Those that once acted as the reason to draw this entity out of him are now standing on the other side of the field looking to do the exact opposite, to help Mob, to save him, to put this genie back into the bottle. And through these individual clashes, what's highlighted isn't how adept they are necessarily, or how strong they have become, or even how they lose, but instead how different they are to the last time they faced each other morally, ethically, and personally. It's a frankly perfect narrative choice in my opinion. Teru versus Mob. If I'm being honest, of the upcoming fights I mentioned, this is the one that received most of the attention from an animation standpoint. On the visual front, there are a lot of comparisons made to the first fight. Instead of fighting for ego, Teru is fighting for the right reasons. Instead of putting other innocent people in danger, he saves them directly and defends them with his dying breaths. He even gets his clothes melted away again, this time not because he's obstinate or big-headed, but because he's courageously standing in front of a hurricane of psychic energy, hoping that if he can just hold on, he can make a difference. He can save Mob. Despite the blood leaving his eyes, his shield shattering, or his skin burning, he wants to save Mob, he wants to save everyone. Ultimately, he doesn't succeed, but he does succeed in showing how much of a radical change his character has undergone in the last 3 seasons, and he saves an enormous amount of people in the process. Koyama versus Mob. Of the 4 encounters Mob squares off against, this is the least impactful and striking in my opinion. In fact, most of it is shown off camera. However, something worth discussing is that Koyama now has made something of himself that is honest. No longer working as the muscle for a criminal syndicate, now he manages and operates out of a small shop. And instead of trying to antagonize someone, in this situation he's very much on the defensive. But perhaps most miraculously, despite there being a tremendous amount of damage being done, despite sirens blaring, and despite evacuation notices being issued, Tsubomi is actually waiting in the park for Mob. Despite being surrounded by all the chaos, she still waits. Now, that is either stupid or immensely honorable. I'm willing to give her the latter, but they aren't necessarily mutually exclusive either, I suppose. Toichiro versus Mob. Toichiro's battle or confrontation with Mob, while getting a substantial amount of flair via some great animation also, has a brilliantly appropriate and resonant conclusion. One that I think we need to see more of in these kinds of series. Toichiro's goal here is to try and save Mob the same way he did for him. He tries to use his power to absorb Mob's energy and closes the gap, making it a war of attrition, but even then, Mob is so savagely powerful. More powerful than he could ever hope to be. And even with the added support of his son Sho, they still aren't anywhere near strong enough to put an end to this here and now. This is where Toichiro knows he has only one option left to take Mob down and to put an end to this. And in identifying this option, he shows just how much he's changed since the end of that 2nd season.
Sho, 肩を貸してくれないか。逃げよう。
A lesser anime would have just indulged in a simple and rather vapid sacrifice, but this is an incredibly mature and moving decision, one that honestly has stayed with me longer than that vapid sacrifice could ever have been, deciding instead to flee with his son, valuing what he has a second shot at, cherishing henceforth. Ritsu versus Mob. More than anything else, this moment really serves to provide us with exposition for Mob's psyche, exposition for the very first time Mob lost it. In other words, the inciting incident that led to this entire story and Mob being the way that he is. Someone who hates who he is deep down. Ritsu says that he used to be scared of this form, thinking that it was a different version of Mob altogether. But now I think he understands that he was wrong, that it's the same older brother that he's always loved, that it's a part of him. And the reason he's so destructive is due to Mob himself not being accepting of that part of him. And it turns out that those times that Ritsu went to Mob and asked if he wanted to talk about things, that they all came from that very day, and Mob's sudden shift in character. He wanted power so that he could be ready for this moment, to be here for his brother, but despite his best efforts, he can't stop Mob. It's from this moment on, Mob continues to walk and we suddenly become privy to a conversation or conflict taking place in his mind, where there's a terrific visual metaphor for exactly what is taking place. It's here we realize that that side of Mob, that part that's being locked away, it isn't necessarily bad, just suppressed beneath years of trauma. And now, it's exploding, ready to take control and to never give it back again. And it's at this point in time, I think we realize that only one person can stop Mob.
心なしか体が重たくねえか
Despite being the final part of this final arc, I wanted to separate this episode from the rest because I think it's just that important. Not just in the context of the story with it providing everything I wanted and more, but also because this is a conclusion that teaches a very valuable lesson everyone, I think, at one point or another in their lives needs to learn. My grandparents never learned this lesson, and many adults haven't learned this lesson. And growing up as a teenager and even a young adult, when I should have, I didn't learn this lesson. Which I think made this episode and finale all the more powerful and personal. Powerful because it is a terrific story to tell in every sense of the word. Personal for reasons I'll be getting into in just a moment. As I'm sure you've noticed in this 3-part series, I love to explore what the music in a story can offer its narrative, how it can frame a scene, and in some cases, what it can tell us about the story it's housed within. This episode does just that and reveals to us the hidden meaning of its third opening theme and indeed the theme of season 3 as a whole. The entire song and its chorus are all about the internal struggle of Mob and this unidentified entity he has to grapple with inside, with the resolution of this season being Mob accepting his other half and becoming
One and only one.
Which makes it all the more interesting that the insert song for this season wasn't that track, but instead 99, the OP from the very first season, and the answer to why that is the case becomes clear when you look at what it represents in context. Each of the opening tracks for these 3 seasons represents something important to the material covered in that section, referring to Mob for the most part. As I mentioned, the opening for season 3 offered a subtle hint towards necessary changes Mob needed to make, that he needs to accept that we are who we are, and that just because you don't like a part of yourself, that doesn't mean that that part isn't necessarily bad or not a part of you. That you need to make an effort not to tear yourself apart and hide away, that you need to present yourself not as a person of compartmented sections, but a person that is just as the song says, one and only one. The second opening's main message is to communicate to Mob that he needs to get ready to achieve his goals, and to remind him in no uncertain terms that he shouldn't be beholden to anyone, that he should treat himself with respect and not as someone else's doormat, to remind him, and indeed all of us, that your life is your own, no one else's. Which brings me to the insert song used in this final episode, the first opening of the entire series, otherwise known as 99. This is my personal favorite of the 3 tracks, and it's the initial and first major lesson Mob learns on his long quest for self-acceptance. So, if the goal of this arc is echoed by the words one and only one from the third OP, and this scene deals with the resolution of that mission statement for Mob accepting himself for who he is, why are we hearing 99, the season 1 OP? Well, because this scene isn't shown from the point of view of Mob, but instead through the eyes of Reigen. And this is what makes this song choice and this scene so intensely powerful and resonant for me. I've alluded to this countless times across this review series that Reigen has, while taking advantage of Mob and those that seek his help through manipulation and deceit, he's also living a life that he isn't proud of or satisfied with. While this series has indeed been about Mob and his growth emotionally and physically, we've also been offered fleeting glimpses behind the curtain of the Reigen character himself. We've heard concerning anecdotes from his childhood about how he never joined any clubs, seen his mother's scathing emails of embarrassment towards her own son, and of course, a feeling expressed by Reigen himself that he may have felt like he missed the train to becoming the person he always wished he could be. And speaking as someone that never really felt like he had direction in life, that felt terrified to let people in growing up, and even lied to friends and family to hide who I was, Reigen, more than Mob or any other character, has emotionally connected with me. I was scared to be who I was in high school. I did what I thought was socially acceptable by going to college, but pushing in that direction just led me to being overworked, tired, exhausted, and dropping out in my 3rd year. I hated it. Following that, unable to deal with the reality, I stopped visiting my friends who were all graduating college and getting great jobs. I couldn't face them. I took up a job in a liquor store and just sort of forgot about it all. And for years, it was that way. And I've never explained this story in a video before, but I used to be really into professional wrestling. The WWE one, not the Olympic wrestling one. I thought that since I was a fan for over a decade that I knew what it took, and I figured one day it could be cool to pursue it as a career. To train super hard and travel to America to audition. And I trained. I trained hard. I trained for 2 years straight and put on a great deal of muscle in the process. I took lessons and classes in both my city and on the other side of my country that I would travel to every week on a rickety bus. All without my friends or my family knowing I put this work in. And then, right as I was about to leave for America, I had to tell my parents. And I'll never forget what my dad said to me. I'll never forget it because it was the moment I proved to myself that I wasn't who I wished I was. He said, "Son, I've never asked you not to do anything before, but please, for the love of God, don't do this." And I could hear the embarrassment in his voice when he was saying this to me. After years of telling myself that I had changed, that I had found what I wanted to do, and after making the plan and sticking to it for years, I listened to him, and I gave up. And to this day, I've never been able to watch wrestling again. This is all, of course, to say that it's easy to identify that one ought to do something in a given situation, but it takes a much stronger person to have the conviction to stick to what they sought out to accomplish in the first place. And at 23 years of age, I proved to myself that I wasn't who I thought I was. I proved to myself that I was the same shy kid who couldn't stand up for himself or be proud of who he was. That moment still, to this day, haunts me, and honestly, I don't think I'd be in the position I am now without it. Because of that decision I made, when I decided that I wanted to pursue another unconventional job in YouTube, and my dad didn't understand that either, when he came to me and had that same talk, I was able to then prove to myself that I had those convictions that I was missing before. And I was able to do that because, at that point, I knew how painful it was to take the easy way out and do as he said. Admitting to yourself you were a liar, that you were a coward, and that you lacked conviction to make your dreams a reality is a horrible existential pill to swallow. And that's what made me cry when I was watching this. And it's why this song was perfect for Reigen. A 28-year-old man having not achieved anything in school, a man who specializes in lying and scamming people, now has to take a series of terrifying steps both metaphorically and literally. Instead of letting his fear of himself take over, Reigen reveals that he's been training, that he won't let Mob win, and that he will, for Mob and for him, reach him. No matter the risks, no matter the fear, no matter what might happen, and as the hurricane of lyrics crash around him, counting his each and every step, eventually the song crescendos. And in that moment, Reigen learns the first lesson he helped to teach Mob in Season 1, that if everyone's not special, maybe he could be what he wants to be. It's the perfect song choice for a 28-year-old man running to catch up with his dreams of being the person he always wished he could have been. And while he still doesn't know if he can be that person, he's willing to take that first step and tell Mob the truth. Despite being an emotional mess with my vision obscured by a tidal wave of tears at this point, I did manage to notice that despite his best efforts, Mob still wasn't willing to listen. And that's when the single best reveal in the series happens. Interestingly, and quite fittingly, the first time Mob uses two hands against someone is against Reigen and Dimple. And I think that's a really nice touch. And what's more is, if you remember from my review of Season 2, my only criticism of the season was that it felt like the two pivotal climaxes of the series had taken place at two different points. Well, this final season remedies all of that, ending with two climaxes to the two biggest arcs of the series, delivering an emotional gut punch the likes of which left me despondent in the best of ways after viewing. I don't say this often, but this climax, this arc, this season, this story is perfect in every sense of the word. I could not in any way change something to make it better. This is a series that needs to be seen by everyone. This climax, this confession, this reconciliation is the scene and moment that Mob Psycho 100 has been building up towards. A place where two characters with effectively the exact same problem, dealing with it in totally different ways, come together to help each other. Mob lies to himself about who he is, and Reigen lies to others about who he is. Both coming from a place of self-loathing and insecurity, Mob through his powers and Reigen not seeing himself as worthy of anyone's time if he were to reveal who he was actually. And what makes this scene so special is that together they provide the other the key, the answer to what they've been looking for all along. Again, this is just a perfect scene and a perfect show. In the end, Mob doesn't get the girl. But that's not really the point. The point, nay, the triumph of this moment, is that he asked her out as himself, who he truly is, and in the end allowed himself to feel all the emotions that come with that brave decision. Initially, I wasn't too warm on this Tsubomi character, but after this climax, after her waiting specifically for him despite all that was going on, I think it's clear to me at least what Mob likes about her now, and if nothing else, in those closing moments of the story, I'm glad that they are still in touch, building their relationship the right way. At the beginning of this video, I thought Season 2's climax was a fitting way to end the series on a high, and I was scared that there wouldn't be enough satisfying story in Season 3 to conclude this series in a fashion that wouldn't feel overshadowed by that climax in the prior season. In hindsight, this is honestly laughable, and for the first time in my life, I'm standing before an anime and I'm struggling to think of a way to describe it that isn't simply perfect. But I will try to condense my final thoughts and wrap up this section. Going into this series, much the same way I went into One Piece, JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, Hunter x Hunter, and many others like them, I was expecting to enjoy myself. And having began this series with an idea of what the author one has to offer, I was expecting a great deal of emotional resonance, with an intensely competent direction for each character involved that delivers a humorous yet emotionally fulfilling tale of good and evil. But I didn't quite understand what I was getting myself into entirely. While Mob Psycho is all of that, the flashy animation, the dramatic moments rich with emotion, and armed with a soundtrack that echoes throughout the story in equal parts awesome and ambient, there's something more to this series that honestly captured my heart in a way no other series has. It's as if while reading or watching this story, one knew something deeply personal about my life, my history, my traumas, my highs and my lows, and delivered this story to reach someone like me, with a complicated yet clear message that encourages all of us to be true to and love what makes us who we are. And that it's the desire to accept yourself and that drive to make ourselves better people that determines who we really are at the end of the day. But in truth, this story isn't about me. It's not even necessarily about Mob himself. It's a story about self-acceptance, about growth and all the mental barriers, otherworldly or otherwise, we build up internally that helps us feel a level of comfort. One that affords us the opportunity not to look at our ugly parts, the parts people have rejected us for, the parts that deeply upset us, that we try to pretend never even really existed. And so we grow up, continuing to lie to ourselves, and for some of us, we never tell ourselves that truth, that we are okay just the way we are, that we're not broken. If there's one thing that I'm taking away from this series as a whole, it's that one is a once-in-a-generation type of artist and writer. Someone that through the medium he chose managed to distill down and communicate what is in actuality a surprisingly complicated issue without making it sound trite or condescending. Growth, it's hard. Self-care is hard, and one knows that. My favorite quote from him is still from this interview when he was asked what Mob Psycho 100 was about, and he said, "What I have in mind is to tell a story of one little step. I don't believe our lives change completely for the better at a short notice. It's all the small progress we make that's important. That's what I think of while drawing this manga. A story of one little step." I don't rate things out of 10 on this channel, but Mob Psycho 100 is unequivocally and without an ounce of reservation from me, a clear and emphatic 10 out of 10 story. One that I believe needs to be seen by any young kid that's struggling to accept who they are and just needs that little bit of encouragement to find the strength within and take that one little step. I've been Totally Not Mark. Thanks for watching.